Hello everyone, I'm the Midnight Truth here to keep you company tonight. I know many of you use these stories to fall asleep, so before we begin, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time is it there? Let's get started. It was the kind of winter night that seemed to press in on the world, smothering it in an eerie, suffocating silence. Snow blanketed the ground in a blinding white sheet, but the stillness was anything but peaceful. There was something in the air, something unseen but undeniable, that made the small town of Winter Hollow feel like a trap waiting to spring. Sarah tightened her scarf around her neck as she trudged through the thick snow, the faint glow of Christmas lights from the neighboring houses casting long flickering shadows across her path. Her breath misted in the icy air, and she kept glancing over her shoulder, her heart pounding faster with every step. It wasn't paranoia. At least that's what she kept telling herself. She had felt it for days now, the sensation of being watched, the prickling at the back of her neck as if unseen eyes were following her every move. She didn't know who or what it was, but the feeling was impossible to ignore. She reached her front door and fumbled with her keys, her hands trembling as she tried to fit the key into the lock. The sound of footsteps crunching in the snow behind her froze her in place. Slowly she turned, her breath catching in her throat. Nothing. The street was empty. The houses stood silent, their windows glowing warmly, oblivious to the icy dread that gripped Sarah's chest. She laughed nervously, shaking her head. "Get a grip, Sarah," she muttered, finally managing to unlock the door and step inside. The warmth of her home enveloped her like a blanket, but it did little to calm her nerves. She set her keys on the counter and turned on the living room lights. The Christmas tree stood in the corner, its twinkling lights casting a soft glow over the room. It should have been comforting, but instead it felt wrong. There was something off about the tree. She couldn't put her finger on it, but the sight of it made her stomach churn. It was as if the ornaments were watching her, their glossy surfaces reflecting her image in distorted, unsettling ways. Sarah shook her head and rubbed her temples. "You're imagining things," she told herself. "It's just a tree." But as the night wore on, the feeling of unease only grew stronger. Strange noises echoed through the house, soft creaks and whispers that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. The temperature dropped, the warmth of the heater failing to keep the chill at bay. And then the knocking started. It was faint at first, barely audible over the sound of the wind outside. But it grew louder, more insistent, until it echoed through the entire house. Sarah's heart raced as she crept toward the front door, her hands trembling. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice wavering. The knocking stopped. Silence. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the doorknob. Every instinct screamed at her not to open it, but curiosity, or perhaps foolishness, got the better of her. Slowly she unlocked the door and pulled it open. The porch was empty. The snow on the ground was undisturbed, no footprints leading to or from her house. But there was something on the doorstep, a small gift-wrapped box with a tag that read, "For Sarah." Her hands shook as she picked up the box and brought it inside. She set it on the kitchen counter, staring at it as if it might come alive. The wrapping paper was pristine, the bow tied perfectly, but there was no indication of who had left it. She debated whether to open it. Part of her wanted to throw it away, to get rid of whatever strange energy it carried. But another part of her, a darker, more curious part, needed to know what was inside. With a deep breath, she untied the bow and carefully peeled back the wrapping paper. Inside was a plain wooden box with a small latch. She opened it, her heart pounding in her chest. Inside the box was a single black and white photograph. It showed a family of 4, a man, a woman, and 2 children, standing in front of a Christmas tree. They were smiling, but their eyes were hollow, their faces twisted in expressions that seemed more like grimaces than joy. Sarah's stomach turned as she realized something else about the photo. The Christmas tree in the background was identical to the one in her living room. Her hands began to shake uncontrollably and she dropped the photo. It fluttered to the floor, landing face up. That's when she saw it. In the reflection of the ornaments on the tree, there was something else. A shadowy figure stood behind the family, its face obscured, its presence ominous. And as she stared at the photo, a soft, raspy voice whispered in her ear, "Do you like your gift?" Sarah froze, her breath caught in her throat. The voice had been so close, as if someone was standing just behind her. She spun around, but the room was empty. The only sound was the faint hum of the heater and the soft ticking of the clock on the wall. She backed away slowly, her eyes darting around the room. Every shadow seemed darker, every corner more menacing. The photo lay on the floor where she had dropped it, the faces of the family staring up at her, lifeless and cold. "Pull it together," she whispered to herself, but the words felt hollow. She picked up the photo with trembling hands and stuffed it back into the box, slamming the lid shut. Whatever this was, she didn't want any part of it. She threw the box into the trash and went to her bedroom, locking the door behind her. She tried to convince herself that it was just a cruel prank, maybe one of her co-workers trying to mess with her. But deep down, she knew that wasn't true. That voice, it had been real, and the feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. She climbed into bed, pulling the blankets up to her chin. The soft glow of the streetlights outside filtered through the curtains, casting faint patterns on the walls. She stared at the ceiling, her mind racing. Minutes turned into hours, and just as she began to drift off, a loud thud jolted her awake. Her heart pounded as she sat up, straining to hear. The sound had come from downstairs. She reached for her phone, but her hands were shaking so badly that she nearly dropped it. She dialed 911 but hesitated before pressing the call button. What would she even say? That she had heard a noise? That someone had left a creepy box on her doorstep? It sounded ridiculous even to her. Taking a deep breath, she grabbed the baseball bat she kept under her bed and crept toward the door. The floorboards creaked under her weight as she made her way downstairs, each step slower and more deliberate than the last. The living room was eerily silent, the Christmas tree still glowing softly in the corner. She scanned the room, her grip tightening on the bat. Then she saw it. The box. It was sitting on the coffee table, perfectly intact, as if she had never thrown it away. Sarah's blood ran cold. She was sure she had tossed it in the trash. She approached it cautiously, her heart hammering in her chest. The box looked exactly as it had before, down to the neatly tied bow. This time there was no photograph inside. Instead, there was a note written in delicate, spidery handwriting. Asterisk, you can't get rid of me. Asterisk. Her hands trembled as she read the words. She dropped the note and backed away, her mind racing. This wasn't just a prank. Whoever, or whatever, was doing this wasn't playing games. The lights flickered, and for a brief moment, the room was plunged into darkness. When they came back on, Sarah gasped. The Christmas tree had changed. The ornaments were no longer the cheerful red and gold she had hung earlier. They were black, glistening like polished obsidian. The tinsel was gone, replaced by strands of something that looked disturbingly like hair. And the angel on top, it was no longer the porcelain figure she had placed there. It was a grotesque, twisted thing, its wings jagged and sharp, its face contorted into a sinister grin. Sarah stumbled back, nearly tripping over the coffee table. She had to get out of the house. She didn't care where she went, she just needed to be anywhere but here. She grabbed her coat and threw open the front door, stepping out into the freezing night. The snow crunched under her boots as she ran down the street, her breath coming in ragged gasps. But no matter how far she ran, the feeling of being watched never left her. She glanced over her shoulder, half expecting to see someone, or something, following her. The streets were empty, the houses dark and silent. It was as if the entire town had gone to sleep, leaving her alone in the frozen darkness. She finally stopped near a small park at the edge of town, collapsing onto a bench. Her breath billowed in the air as she tried to calm herself. She took out her phone and called her best friend, Emily. The phone rang twice before Emily picked up. Sarah? What's wrong? Sarah could barely form the words. Something's happening. I don't know what to do. Emily's voice was calm but concerned. Okay, slow down. Where are you? I'm at the park. I had to get out of the house. There's something in there, Emily. I don't know what it is, but it's not normal. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Sarah, listen to me. You need to come to my place. We'll figure this out together. Sarah nodded, even though Emily couldn't see her. Okay, I'm on my way. She hung up and stood, her legs trembling. The walk to Emily's house wasn't far, but every step felt like a mile. The shadows seemed to shift and move around her, and the sound of her footsteps echoed unnaturally loud in the still night. When she finally reached Emily's house, she felt a small surge of relief. The porch light was on and the curtains were drawn, giving the house a warm, inviting glow. She knocked on the door, her breath hitching as she waited. Emily opened it almost immediately, pulling her inside. Sarah, you're freezing. What happened? Sarah collapsed onto the couch, her hands still shaking. It's, it's hard to explain. There was this box and... Before she could finish, Emily's expression changed. Her eyes widened and she took a step back. Sarah, did you bring it with you? Sarah frowned. What are you talking about? Emily pointed to the coffee table. There, sitting in the middle of the table, was the box. Sarah stared at the box, her heart pounding so loudly she could barely hear Emily's panicked breathing. It couldn't be real. She had left it behind in her own house. There was no way it could have followed her here. Emily's voice broke through the suffocating silence. Sarah, what is that? I don't know, Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. It was on my doorstep. I threw it away, but it keeps showing up. Emily took a cautious step back, her eyes locked on the box as if it might spring to life at any moment. This isn't normal. Sarah, you need to tell me everything. Sarah recounted everything. The photograph, the note, the changes to her Christmas tree. She left nothing out, her words tumbling over each other in her desperation to make Emily understand. When she finished, Emily's face was pale. She sat down slowly, her gaze still fixed on the box. We need to get rid of it. For real this time. I've tried, Sarah said, her voice cracking. It won't go away. Emily didn't respond. Instead, she grabbed a pair of thick oven mitts from the kitchen and cautiously approached the box, as if touching it directly might somehow bind her to its curse. Sarah watched, her stomach twisting with dread. Emily picked up the box and marched toward the fireplace. We'll burn it, she said, her tone firm. Whatever it is, it won't survive the fire. Sarah wanted to believe her, but something deep inside told her it wouldn't be that simple. Emily opened the fireplace and tossed the box onto the crackling flames. They both watched as the flames engulfed the box, the wrapping paper curling and blackening almost instantly. For a moment, Sarah felt a flicker of hope. But then the flames flickered, once, twice, and died out completely, leaving the box unscathed. Emily gasped, stumbling back. That's not possible, she whispered. Sarah's voice was barely audible. I told you. It doesn't go away. As they stared at the box, a low, rumbling noise filled the room. It was soft at first, like distant thunder, but it grew louder and more intense until the very walls seemed to vibrate. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the noise stopped. The box sat there, untouched, as if mocking their futile attempts to destroy it. Emily turned to Sarah, her face a mask of terror. We need help. This is way beyond us. Sarah nodded, her throat dry. Who do we even call? The police? A priest? I don't know, Emily admitted. But we can't stay here. We need to get out. The two women grabbed their coats and fled the house, leaving the box sitting in the cold, dark fireplace. They didn't know where they were going, only that they needed to get as far away as possible. The streets were eerily quiet as they walked, the snow crunching beneath their boots. The Christmas lights that decorated the houses seemed dimmer, their cheerful glow replaced by a faint, unnatural flicker. As they walked, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were being followed. She kept glancing over her shoulder, but the streets were empty. Still, the sensation grew stronger with every step, like an invisible weight pressing down on her. Emily must have felt it too, because she suddenly stopped and grabbed Sarah's arm. Do you hear that? Sarah listened, her breath catching in her throat. At first she heard nothing but the wind. But then, faintly, she caught it, a soft, melodic humming. It sounded like a Christmas carol, but the tune was off, distorted in a way that made her skin crawl. The sound seemed to come from all around them, growing louder and more menacing with every passing second. Run, Emily whispered. They took off, their feet slipping on the icy pavement as they sprinted down the street. The humming followed them, growing louder and louder until it was deafening. They turned a corner and ducked into an alley, pressing themselves against the wall in an attempt to hide. Sarah's chest heaved as she tried to catch her breath, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst. The humming stopped. For a moment, there was only silence. Then a shadow moved at the end of the alley. It was tall and thin, its movements jerky and unnatural. It didn't walk so much as it glided, its feet never seeming to touch the ground. Sarah and Emily froze, their eyes wide with terror. The shadow paused, its head tilting as if it were listening. Sarah's hand tightened around Emily's, her mind racing. They had to move, but any sound could give them away. The shadow took a step closer and then another. Its head tilted again, and Sarah realized with a sickening jolt that it was sniffing the air. It knew they were there. Without thinking, Sarah grabbed a broken piece of wood from the ground and hurled it toward the other end of the alley. The shadow whipped around, drawn to the noise. "Go," Sarah whispered, pulling Emily with her. They ran as fast as they could, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. The shadow's presence seemed to linger, but when they finally emerged onto a busy street, it was gone. The bustling crowd and bright lights were a stark contrast to the terror they had just experienced. People milled about, laughing and chatting as if nothing was wrong. But Sarah and Emily knew better. Whatever was happening, it wasn't over. They found a small diner and slipped inside, collapsing into a booth near the back. The warmth of the room was comforting, but it did little to calm their nerves. "What was that?" Emily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know," Sarah admitted, "but I think it's connected to the box." Emily frowned. "We need answers. There has to be someone who knows what's going on." As they sat there, a waitress approached their table. She was an older woman with kind eyes and a warm smile. "What can I get you too?" Sarah hesitated, but Emily spoke up. "Just coffee, please." The waitress nodded and walked away, but something about her caught Sarah's attention. There was a strange symbol embroidered on her apron, a circle with jagged lines radiating from the center. It looked familiar, but Sarah couldn't place it. When the waitress returned with their coffee, Sarah decided to take a chance. "Excuse me," she said, her voice trembling. "That symbol on your apron, what does it mean?" The waitress's smile faded and her eyes darkened. She glanced around the diner as if checking to see if anyone was listening. "You need to leave," she said quietly. "What?" Emily asked, startled. The waitress leaned in closer, her voice barely audible. "That symbol, it's a warning. If you've seen it, it's already too late." Sarah's blood ran cold. Too late for what? The waitress didn't answer. Instead, she straightened up and walked away, leaving Sarah and Emily sitting in stunned silence. The box wasn't just a curse. It was a message, and whatever it was warning them about, it was coming. The diner felt suffocating now, its warmth no longer comforting but stifling. Sarah's hands trembled as she gripped the edge of the table, her mind spinning with the waitress's cryptic warning. Emily sat across from her, silent and pale, staring into her coffee as if it might hold the answers they so desperately needed. The symbol, the words, the box. Everything was spiraling out of control, and Sarah felt like she was slipping further into a nightmare she couldn't wake from. "We can't just sit here," Emily whispered finally, breaking the tense silence. "That woman knows something. We need to talk to her again." Sarah nodded, though her body felt heavy, weighed down by fear. They both turned to look for the waitress, but she was nowhere to be seen. The counter was empty, the coffee pot abandoned. "Where did she go?" Emily asked, her voice rising with panic. Before Sarah could respond, the door to the kitchen swung open, and a different waitress emerged. She was younger, with a cheerful smile that felt out of place in the growing tension. "Excuse me," Sarah said, her voice shaky. "The other waitress, the one with the symbol on her apron, where is she?" The younger woman tilted her head, confused. "I'm sorry, but we don't have anyone like that working here." Emily froze. "What are you talking about?" "She was just here. She brought us coffee." The waitress's smile faltered, and she glanced nervously toward the kitchen. "You must be mistaken. I've been the only one on shift tonight." Sarah's stomach dropped. "But we saw her. She was real." The waitress took a small step back, her cheerful demeanor cracking. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said quickly before retreating to the kitchen. Sarah and Emily exchanged a glance, the unspoken fear passing between them like a current. Something was very, very wrong. "We need to get out of here," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. Emily didn't argue. They threw a few bills onto the table and hurried out of the diner, the cold night air hitting them like a slap. The streets were quieter now, the festive decorations casting long, eerie shadows on the snow-covered ground. "What do we do?" Emily asked, her voice trembling. Sarah took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. "We need answers. If that symbol is a warning, there has to be someone who knows what it means." Emily hesitated, then nodded. "But who?" "We don't exactly have a lot of options." Sarah thought for a moment, her mind racing. Then she remembered. "There's an old bookshop near the edge of town," she said. "The owner, Mr. Grayson, he's Eccentric, but he knows a lot about weird stuff. Maybe he can help? Emily looked uncertain but didn't protest. Fine. Let's go. The walk to the bookshop was tense and silent, the weight of the situation pressing down on them like a heavy blanket. Every shadow seemed to shift, every distant sound made them jump. When they finally reached the shop, it was dark, the windows covered in frost. A small, flickering sign above the door read Grayson's Rare Books. Sarah knocked, the sound echoing in the still night. For a moment there was no response. Then, the faint glow of a light appeared in the back of the shop, and the door creaked open. Mr. Grayson stood there, his wiry frame silhouetted against the dim light. His sharp, piercing eyes studied them for a moment before he spoke. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice low and gravelly. Sarah stepped forward, desperation overriding her fear. "Please, we need your help. It's about this symbol." She described the symbol to him, and his expression darkened. Without a word, he stepped aside and motioned for them to enter. The shop was cramped and cluttered, the air thick with the scent of old paper and dust. Shelves lined the walls, packed with books that looked as though they hadn't been touched in decades. Mr. Grayson led them to a small table in the back, where he pulled out a worn leather-bound book. He flipped through the pages with practiced ease before stopping on a page that made Sarah's blood run cold. The symbol was there, sketched in black ink, surrounded by strange, looping text that she couldn't read. "This," Mr. Grayson said, pointing to the symbol, "is the mark of the Watcher." "The Watcher," Emily repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. Grayson nodded. "An ancient entity older than time itself. It observes, it waits, and when it chooses you, there is no escape." Sarah's stomach churned. "Why us? Why now?" Grayson's gaze was heavy. "The Watcher is drawn to weakness, to fear. It finds those who are vulnerable, who are on the edge, and it latches on. But it doesn't just want to scare you. It wants to consume you." Emily's voice shook. "Consume us? What does that mean?" "It feeds on your fear, your despair," Grayson explained. "The more you give into it, the stronger it becomes. And once it has enough, it takes you." Sarah felt like she might collapse. "How do we stop it?" Grayson hesitated, his expression grim. "You can't stop it, but there is a way to weaken its hold." He reached into a drawer and pulled out a small, intricately carved box. Inside was a single candle, its wax black as night. "This is a binding candle," he said. "It can trap the Watcher temporarily, but it's not a permanent solution. You'll need to confront it directly to end this." Emily shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "Confront it? Are you insane? We'll die." "You don't have a choice," Grayson said firmly. "If you don't fight it, it will never stop." Sarah took the candle, her hands trembling. "What do we have to do?" Grayson leaned in, his voice low and urgent. "Light the candle when you feel its presence. It will reveal its true form, but you mustn't look away. If you do, the binding will fail and it will take you." Sarah nodded, her heart pounding. "And then what?" Grayson's expression darkened. "Then you'll have to find the heart of its power and destroy it. But be warned, once you light this candle, there's no turning back." The night air was colder than before, cutting through Sarah's coat and chilling her to the bone. She held the binding candle tightly in her hands as she and Emily left the shop, Mr. Grayson's warning ringing in her ears. "There's no turning back now," she murmured, mostly to herself. Emily didn't respond. She walked silently beside Sarah, her face pale and drawn. Her eyes flickered nervously toward the darkened streets, as if expecting the Watcher to materialize out of the shadows. "We need to think this through," Emily said finally, her voice shaky. "Grayson didn't exactly give us a step-by-step guide. What if we screw this up? What if—" "We don't have time to second-guess," Sarah interrupted. "You heard him. If we don't act, it will consume us. We can't just wait around for that to happen." Emily hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. "Okay, so where do we start?" Sarah stopped walking, her mind racing. The candle felt heavier in her hands, as though it carried the weight of their survival. Grayson said to light the candle when we feel its presence. That's when it will show itself. We need to figure out where it's strongest. Emily looked around, her expression skeptical. "And how are we supposed to do that? It's not like it left us a trail to follow." But even as she said the words, a strange sensation washed over Sarah. A faint, almost imperceptible pull, like an invisible thread tugging at her chest. It wasn't a physical force, but something deeper, more instinctual. "Do you feel that?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Emily frowned. "Feel what?" "It's hard to explain," Sarah said. "It's like something's drawing me in a certain direction. I think it's the Watcher." Emily's eyes widened. "Are you sure? What if it's a trap?" Sarah tightened her grip on the candle. "We don't have a choice. If this is the only lead we have to follow it." Reluctantly, Emily nodded and they began to walk. The pull grew stronger with each step, guiding Sarah through the winding streets of the town. The festive decorations that had once felt warm and cheerful now seemed eerie and foreboding, their shadows stretching and twisting in the faint glow of the streetlights. The town grew quieter as they walked, the hum of distant traffic fading into silence. Sarah's breath clouded in the freezing air, and she couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Finally, the pole led them to the edge of town, where an old, abandoned church stood shrouded in darkness. Its towering spire loomed against the night sky, and the stained glass windows were cracked and weathered. "Of course it's the creepiest place in town," Emily muttered, her voice trembling. Sarah swallowed hard, forcing herself to stay calm. This has to be it. The pull was almost overwhelming now, a relentless force that seemed to emanate from within the church. Sarah pushed open the heavy wooden door, its hinges groaning in protest. The inside of the church was cold and empty, the air thick with the scent of decay. Moonlight filtered through the broken windows, casting fragmented patterns on the stone floor. Sarah took a deep breath and lit the candle. The flame sputtered to life, its light unnaturally bright against the darkness. For a moment nothing happened. The silence stretched on, heavy and oppressive. Then a low, guttural sound echoed through the church, sending chills down Sarah's spine. Emily grabbed Sarah's arm. "What was that?" Before Sarah could answer, the shadows began to shift. The darkness seemed to come alive, coalescing into a tall, grotesque figure at the far end of the church. Its form was indistinct, its edges blurring and shifting like smoke. But its eyes, cold, unblinking, and filled with malice, were unmistakable. "It's here," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. The Watcher moved closer, its presence suffocating. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest, but she forced herself to keep her eyes on it. Grayson's warning echoed in her mind, "Don't look away." The Watcher's voice was a low, guttural hiss that seemed to echo from all around them. "You cannot escape me." Sarah's grip on the candle tightened. "Why are you doing this? What do you want from us?" The Watcher didn't answer. Instead, it raised a clawed hand, and the air around them grew colder. The flame of the candle flickered, and for a terrifying moment, Sarah thought it might go out. Emily's voice broke through the suffocating silence. "Sarah, what do we do?" "We stand our ground," Sarah said firmly, though her voice trembled. "We can't let it win." The Watcher let out a low, rumbling laugh. "Brave words. But bravery will not save you." Suddenly, the ground beneath them began to tremble, and the walls of the church seemed to close in. Sarah felt an overwhelming wave of fear wash over her, but she refused to let it consume her. She held the candle higher, its light cutting through the darkness. "You don't control us," she said, her voice steady. "We're not afraid of you." The Watcher hissed, its form shifting and writhing. For a moment, it seemed to falter, its edges blurring as if the light of the candle was weakening it. Emily's voice was urgent. "It's working. Keep going." Sarah took a step forward, the candle's flame burning brighter. "You feed on fear, but we're not going to give you what you want. You're nothing but a shadow, a parasite." The Watcher let out a piercing shriek, its form unraveling like smoke in the wind. The ground stopped trembling, and the oppressive darkness began to lift. But just as Sarah thought they might have won, the Watcher's voice echoed through the church, low and menacing. "This is not over." With a final, ear-splitting shriek, the Watcher vanished, leaving the church in silence. Sarah and Emily stood frozen, their breaths coming in short, ragged gasps. "What just happened?" Emily whispered. Sarah extinguished the candle, her hands shaking. "I think we bought ourselves some time." Emily looked at her, fear etched into her face. "But for how long?" The cold air outside the church was like a slap to the face, sharp and biting. Sarah and Emily stumbled into the night, their breaths coming in quick, panicked gasps. Neither of them spoke, their minds reeling from what they had just faced. The world outside seemed eerily still, as if even the wind held its breath in anticipation. Sarah clutched the now extinguished binding candle to her chest, its weight a grim reminder of the encounter. The Watcher's final words echoed in her mind, "This is not over. What do we do now?" Emily's voice was barely a whisper, but it carried the weight of their shared fear. Sarah forced herself to think, to push past the terror threatening to paralyze her. "We need to figure out what it meant, what it's really after." Grayson said we'd have to destroy the heart of its power, but he didn't say where to find it. Emily shivered, wrapping her arms tightly around herself. What if there isn't a heart? What if this thing just exists and there's no way to stop it? "There has to be a way," Sarah insisted, though her voice betrayed her uncertainty. "We've made it this far. We can't give up now." They began walking, the quiet streets of the town feeling alien and unfamiliar. The festive lights that once seemed cheerful now flickered ominously, casting strange, shifting shadows. Every sound, a distant car, the crunch of snow underfoot, set their nerves on edge. As they passed a small park, Sarah suddenly stopped. She stared at the snow-covered ground, her brow furrowed. "Emily," she said slowly, "do you see that?" Emily followed her gaze. At first, she saw nothing but snow and frost-covered benches. Then she noticed it, faint footprints too large to be human, leading away from the park and toward the dense woods beyond. "Those weren't here before," Emily said, her voice trembling. Sarah nodded. "I think it's trying to lead us somewhere." Emily grabbed her arm. "You can't seriously be thinking about following those. It's obviously a trap." Sarah hesitated. Her instinct screamed at her to turn back to find safety, but she knew there was no escaping this. The Watcher wouldn't stop until it had what it wanted. "It's a risk we have to take," Sarah said finally. "If we don't confront it, it'll just keep coming for us." Emily's face was pale, but she nodded reluctantly. "Fine. But if this goes south, I'm blaming you." With that, they began to follow the footprints, their steps crunching softly in the snow. The path led them deeper into the woods, the towering trees casting long, foreboding shadows. The further they went, the darker it became, until the only light came from the faint glow of the moon. The woods were eerily quiet, the usual sounds of rustling leaves and distant animals absent. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The footprints ended abruptly in a small clearing. At the center stood an old, crumbling well, its stones covered in moss and frost. Emily stared at it, her eyes wide with fear. "Why does this feel like something out of a horror movie?" Sarah didn't answer. She stepped closer to the well, her heart pounding. The air around it felt different, heavier, colder, as if the well exuded its own presence. Suddenly, a faint sound broke the silence. It was a low, guttural whisper, barely audible but unmistakably real. Sarah froze. "Did you hear that?" Emily nodded, her face pale. "It's coming from the well." Sarah leaned closer, her breath visible in the icy air. The whisper grew louder, forming words that sent chills down her spine. "Come closer," it beckoned. "See what lies beneath." Emily grabbed Sarah's arm, her voice urgent. "Sarah, don't. This is exactly what it wants." But Sarah couldn't move. The voice was compelling, pulling her toward the well like a siren's call. She felt an overwhelming urge to look inside, to see what was hidden in the darkness. "Sarah." Emily's voice broke through the spell, and Sarah snapped back to reality. She took a shaky step back, her heart racing. "We need to figure out what's down there. If this is connected to the Watcher, it could be the key to stopping it." Emily looked at her like she was insane. "You're not seriously thinking about climbing into that thing, are you?" Sarah hesitated, then shook her head. "Not without a plan. Let's see if there's another way to figure out what we're dealing with." They circled the well, searching for any clues or markings. On the side opposite the footprints, Sarah noticed something carved into the stone, a symbol identical to the one on the box they'd found. "It's the same symbol," she said, running her fingers over the grooves. Emily frowned. "So this definitely has something to do with the Watcher. But what are we supposed to do with it?" Before Sarah could respond, the ground beneath them began to tremble. The whispering voices grew louder, overlapping until they became a deafening cacophony. Then, the well erupted with a blinding light, and a wave of icy air knocked them to the ground. When Sarah opened her eyes, she saw a figure standing at the edge of the well. It was the Watcher, its shadowy form more distinct than before. You've come far, it said, its voice echoing in the stillness. But you cannot win. Sarah scrambled to her feet, holding the binding candle in front of her like a weapon. We're not afraid of you, she said, though her voice trembled. The watcher laughed, a deep, guttural sound that seemed to shake the air around them. Your courage is admirable, but it is meaningless. You are already mine. Suddenly, the light from the well dimmed, and the watcher raised a clawed hand. The shadows around them began to shift and writhe, forming twisted shapes that advanced toward Sarah and Emily. Light the candle, Emily shouted, her voice filled with panic. Sarah fumbled with the candle, her hands shaking as she tried to ignite it. The twisted shadows grew closer, their forms becoming more distinct. Finally, the candle's flames sputtered to life, and its light cut through the darkness. The shadows recoiled, hissing and writhing as they dissolved into nothingness. The watcher let out an ear-piercing shriek, its form flickering like a dying flame. This is not the end, it hissed, before vanishing into the darkness. Sarah and Emily stood in stunned silence, the only sound their ragged breathing. What just happened? Emily asked, her voice barely audible. I don't know, Sarah admitted. But whatever it is, we're not done yet. The silence in the woods was absolute, the kind that made even the faintest whisper feel like a shout. Sarah and Emily stood frozen by the well, the last traces of the watcher's presence fading into the frigid night. But the air around them was still heavy, charged with a sense of foreboding that neither of them could shake. Sarah clutched the binding candle, its faintly flickering flame casting long shadows across her face. Her thoughts churned, a chaotic mix of fear, determination, and confusion. The watcher's final words echoed in her mind, their weight pressing down on her like a physical force. This is not the end. Sarah, Emily said quietly, breaking the tense silence. We need to get out of here. Now. Sarah nodded, but her feet felt rooted to the ground. Her gaze lingered on the well, its jagged stones now cold and silent. A part of her was certain that the answers they needed lay somewhere within its depths, but the thought of descending into that darkness sent a shiver down her spine. Emily tugged on her arm. Sarah, seriously, let's go. Reluctantly, Sarah tore her eyes away from the well and followed Emily back through the woods. The trail of footprints that had led them there was gone, erased as if it had never existed. The oppressive silence was broken only by the crunch of their boots in the snow, a sound that felt unnervingly loud in the stillness. When they finally emerged from the woods, the sight of the town's dimly lit streets should have been a relief. But the festive decorations now seemed grotesque, their cheerful glow a mocking contrast to the darkness that clung to Sarah's thoughts. As they approached Sarah's house, Emily stopped abruptly. What's wrong? Sarah asked, her voice sharp with tension. Emily pointed to the window. The living room light was on, casting a warm, flickering glow that shouldn't have been possible. Sarah's parents were out of town, and she hadn't left any lights on when they'd left. Stay here, Sarah said, her voice low. No way, Emily shot back. I'm not letting you go in there alone. Sarah hesitated, then nodded. Together, they approached the front door, their breaths visible in the icy air. Sarah turned the handle slowly, wincing as the door creaked open. The living room was eerily quiet, the only sound the faint hum of the heater. The source of the flickering light was a small candle on the coffee table, its flame unnaturally steady despite the drafty room. Beside it lay an envelope, its surface marked with the same strange symbol they'd seen on the box in the well. Emily's eyes widened. That wasn't here before. No kidding, Sarah muttered, her heart pounding. She picked up the envelope, her fingers trembling as she broke the seal. Inside was a single piece of paper, its surface covered in jagged, almost illegible handwriting. Asterisk, you cannot run. You cannot hide. The end begins where it all began, asterisk. Sarah read the message aloud, her voice barely above a whisper. What does it mean? Emily asked, her voice tinged with panic. I don't know, Sarah admitted. But as she stared at the words, a memory stirred in the back of her mind, a fragment of a conversation she'd had with her grandmother years ago. When you're lost, her grandmother had said, sometimes you have to go back to where it all started to find your way. Sarah's grip on the paper tightened. I think it's telling us to go back to the orphanage. Emily stared at her in disbelief. Are you serious? That place is practically falling apart. And didn't you say it burned down years ago? Sarah nodded slowly. But it's the only place that makes sense. That's where I first saw the Watcher, where all of this started. Emily groaned. This just keeps getting better and better. Despite her friends' protests, Sarah was resolute. They gathered supplies, flashlights, extra batteries, and a thermos of coffee, and set out for the outskirts of town, where the remnants of the orphanage still stood. The drive was tense and silent, the radio turned off to avoid the eerie static that had plagued them earlier. When they arrived, the sight of the crumbling building sent a chill through Sarah. The orphanage was a skeletal ruin, its charred beams and broken windows a stark reminder of the fire that had consumed it years ago. The air around the orphanage felt heavy, thick with an almost tangible sense of dread. Sarah hesitated at the entrance, her flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. "Are you sure about this?" Emily asked, her voice trembling. "No," Sarah admitted, "but we don't have a choice." They stepped inside, the floorboards creaking ominously under their weight. The interior was a maze of debris and decay, the once familiar halls now unrecognizable. As they moved deeper into the building, Sarah felt a strange sense of déjà vu. The layout of the orphanage was etched into her memory, but now it felt distorted, wrong. The corridors seemed to twist and shift, leading them in circles. "This isn't right," Emily said, her voice panicked. "We've passed this same room 3 times now." Sarah frowned, trying to ignore the growing sense of unease. "It's like it's playing with us." Emily's flashlight flickered, and she cursed under her breath. "This place is seriously messed up." They continued forward, their footsteps echoing in the empty halls. Finally, they reached what had once been the orphanage's main office. The door was slightly ajar, and the air inside was colder than the rest of the building. Sarah pushed the door open, her flashlight beam sweeping across the room. At the center of the floor was a circle of symbols, identical to the one on the box, the well, and the envelope. "What is this?" Emily whispered, her voice barely audible. Before Sarah could answer, the temperature dropped sharply, and the shadows in the room began to shift. The Watcher's voice echoed from all around them, low and menacing. "You've returned." How predictable. Sarah's heart raced as the Watcher's form began to materialize within the circle. Its presence was even more oppressive than before, its cold, unblinking eyes fixed on her. "This ends here," Sarah said, her voice shaking but determined. The Watcher laughed, a deep, guttural sound that seemed to reverberate through the walls. "You cannot end what you do not understand." Sarah tightened her grip on the binding candle, its flame flickering to life. "Maybe not, but I'm willing to try." The flame of the binding candle seemed impossibly fragile against the looming presence of the Watcher. Its cold, shadowy form twisted and writhed within the circle, the air around it crackling with an unnatural energy. Sarah felt the weight of its gaze, a suffocating pressure that made her knees weak. "You think that trinket will save you?" the Watcher hissed, its voice a chilling blend of mockery and malice. Sarah swallowed hard, forcing herself to stand her ground. "It stopped you before. It'll stop you again." The Watcher's laughter was low and resonant, a sound that seemed to vibrate through the very fabric of the room. "You've barely scratched the surface of what I am. Do you think light can banish the dark when the dark is endless?" Emily, standing just behind Sarah, was trembling visibly. "What do we do, Sarah? We can't just stand here." Sarah's mind raced, her thoughts a chaotic jumble of fear and determination. The symbols on the floor seemed to pulse faintly, as if reacting to the Watcher's presence. There was something significant about them, something she felt she was supposed to understand. "Emily," she said, her voice tight, "check the drawers. See if there's anything in here that might help." Emily hesitated but nodded, moving quickly to the old, decrepit desk in the corner. She rifled through the drawers, her movements frantic. "There's just a bunch of papers and wait." She pulled out a small leather-bound book, its cover etched with the same strange symbol. "I think this is it." Sarah glanced back at her, the flickering light of the candle casting deep shadows across her face. "Open it. See if there's anything useful." Emily flipped through the pages, her eyes scanning the handwritten text. "It's a journal. Looks like it belonged to someone who worked here. There's a lot about rituals and—" "Oh no." "What?" Sarah asked, her voice sharp. Emily looked up, her face pale. "It says the circle isn't to contain the Watcher. It's to summon it. We're standing in the middle of its anchor point." The Watcher's laughter grew louder, a mocking crescendo that filled the room. "At last you begin to understand. You brought yourselves to me. The realization hit Sarah like a punch to the gut. She had walked right into the Watcher's trap. The symbols, the journal, the well, it had all been orchestrated to lead her here. "We have to break the circle," Sarah said urgently. "If it's an anchor, destroying it might sever its connection." Emily hesitated. "Are you sure? What if it makes things worse?" "It can't get much worse than this," Sarah snapped. "Just do it." Emily dropped to her knees, using her hands to smear the chalk lines of the circle. The symbols resisted at first, glowing faintly as if trying to hold themselves together. But with enough effort they began to dissolve. The Watcher let out an ear-splitting shriek, its form flickering violently. "You cannot escape me," it roared, its voice a thunderous echo. The moment the circle was broken, the oppressive energy in the room shifted. The Watcher's form wavered, its edges blurring as if it were being pulled in multiple directions. "Run!" Sarah shouted, grabbing Emily's arm. They bolted from the room, the Watcher's shrieks following them like a physical force. The building seemed to come alive around them, the walls groaning and the floor buckling beneath their feet. As they reached the front door, the entire orphanage shuddered, a deep, rumbling sound reverberating through its structure. "Go, go, go!" Sarah yelled, shoving Emily ahead of her. They stumbled out into the icy night just as the building collapsed in on itself, a deafening crash that sent a plume of dust and debris into the air. For a moment, neither of them could move. They stood there, panting and shivering, staring at the ruins of the orphanage. "Is it gone?" Emily asked hesitantly. Sarah shook her head. "I don't think so. That felt too easy." As if in response, the ground beneath their feet began to tremble. The snow-covered earth cracked and split, and a dark, viscous substance began to seep up from the fissures. "Sarah," Emily said, her voice trembling. "What is that?" "I don't know," Sarah admitted, taking a step back. The dark substance began to coalesce, rising up and taking shape. Within moments, the Watcher's form emerged, more solid and menacing than ever before. "You cannot destroy me," it said, its voice a low, guttural growl. "I am eternal." Sarah clenched her fists, the binding candle still flickering in her hand. "Then we'll find a way to end you." The Watcher's eyes gleamed with a malevolent light. "You are nothing but a pawn in a game you cannot comprehend. Every step you take, every action you make, brings you closer to my grasp." Sarah refused to let it see her fear. "If this is a game, then I'm changing the rules." Before the Watcher could respond, Sarah turned to Emily. "We need to find the heart. The journal mentioned something about a source of its power, right?" Emily nodded quickly, flipping through the journal's pages with trembling hands. "Yes, but it doesn't say where it is. Just that it's hidden in plain sight." Sarah's mind raced. Hidden in plain sight. The phrase felt like a riddle, one she didn't have time to solve. "Think," she muttered to herself. "What's the one place we haven't looked?" Emily's eyes widened. The church. The altar. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. It made sense. The church had been where they'd first tried to confront the Watcher, where they'd used the binding candle to banish it temporarily. "We have to go back," Sarah said. Emily looked at her like she was insane. "Are you serious? That thing will follow us." "It's already following us," Sarah pointed out. "But if we can destroy the heart, we can end this for good." Reluctantly, Emily nodded. "Fine. But if we die, I'm blaming you." The journey to the church was fraught with tension. The night was uncomfortably still, the snow falling in thick, heavy flakes that blurred the line between sky and earth. Sarah and Emily's breath came out in short, misty puffs, but the chill in the air wasn't the only thing weighing on them. Every step they took seemed to bring them closer to something dark and inevitable, the Watcher's presence lingering like a shadow just out of sight. The sound of their boots crunching in the snow was the only noise between them, and the longer they walked, the heavier the silence became. "It's too quiet," Emily muttered, glancing nervously over her shoulder. "I don't like this. It feels wrong." Sarah didn't respond immediately, her thoughts preoccupied with the task at hand. The church, a stone structure that loomed at the end of the street, was a familiar sight. It was a place where many of the townspeople had gathered over the years, the sanctuary offering peace and solace. But Sarah knew that peace had long since been shattered. The Watcher's malevolent presence had tainted every corner of the town, and the church was no exception. When they finally reached the steps of the church, Sarah stopped. The front doors were wide open, an invitation, or a warning, carved into the air. The eerie stillness of the churchyard was overwhelming. She could hear her heartbeat thundering in her ears, a steady rhythm that threatened to drown out everything else. "This is it," she said, her voice low and resolute. "This is where it all ends." Emily glanced nervously at the church doors, but Sarah could see the determination in her eyes. There was no turning back now. With a deep breath, Sarah pushed the doors open. The church inside was exactly as she remembered it, cold, empty, and untouched by time. The high arches stretched far above them, the stained glass windows casting muted colors across the dusty pews. But there was something different now. The air felt thick, as if the weight of centuries of memories had condensed into the very walls, leaving behind an oppressive, suffocating presence. "We need to get to the altar," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the rising dread in her chest. The altar, where Sarah had once found solace, now seemed like a beacon of impending doom. The floorboards creaked beneath their feet as they moved forward, their steps echoing through the cavernous space. But just as they reached the first row of pews, a voice, low, distorted, and unnervingly close, whispered through the air. "You came back." Sarah froze, her heart skipping a beat. The sound was coming from all directions, a chorus of whispers that crawled under her skin. She spun around, her eyes wide, but saw nothing. "Emily," she whispered, barely able to speak. "Did you hear that?" Emily was staring straight ahead, her face pale. "I hear it everywhere. I don't think we're alone." Suddenly, the temperature dropped. The cold became unbearable, the air thick with the weight of something ancient and malevolent. The church seemed to stretch around them, its once peaceful architecture now distorted, as if warping to accommodate the sinister force that had taken root there. "Sarah," Emily's voice trembled. "Look." Sarah followed her gaze to the altar. The familiar wooden table, with its worn edges and simple design, had changed. The surface was slick with black, tar-like substance that seemed to move, slithering like something alive. The smell was unbearable, like burnt metal and decay. A figure appeared at the altar, its form cloaked in shadows. "The Watcher." "I told you," it said, its voice a low, guttural hiss that seemed to vibrate through the church. "You cannot escape me. This place is mine now." Sarah took a step back, her hands trembling around the binding candle. She could feel the oppressive weight of its words pressing down on her chest. The Watcher was no longer just an entity, it was a force, one that had been feeding on fear and chaos for far longer than she could comprehend. Emily grabbed Sarah's arm, pulling her to the side. "We need to do something now. That thing's not going to let us leave." "I know," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I think the heart of its power is the altar. If we can destroy it how?" Emily asked, fear in her voice. "We don't have any more tricks up our sleeves." "Not yet," Sarah muttered, her eyes scanning the church for anything that might help. Then she spotted something, a small, intricate pattern etched into the floor in front of the altar, hidden beneath the layers of dust. She crouched down, brushing away the debris. It was a symbol, one that looked strikingly familiar. The same symbol that had been on the box, the well, and the journal. It was part of the ritual. "I think this is it," Sarah said, her voice steadying with newfound resolve. "This is how we end it." The Watcher let out a mocking laugh, a sound that seemed to shake the very foundations of the church. "You cannot stop me. I am eternal. This is where I was born, and this is where I will rise again." Sarah's grip on the binding candle tightened. "We'll see about that." She stood up and began tracing the symbol on the floor, her fingers moving over the cold stone with precision. Emily watched her, her expression a mixture of fear and disbelief. "Are you sure this will work?" "It has to," Sarah replied. "The journal said this is the key to breaking the connection." As she finished tracing the last line of the symbol, the air grew colder. The Watcher's form began to writhe, its dark shape growing more distorted with each passing second. "You are only delaying the inevitable," it growled. "You cannot kill what is already dead." The room seemed to darken as Sarah stood in the center of the symbol, the binding candle flickering violently in her hand. The Watcher's whispers filled the air, growing louder, more insistent. Suddenly, the candle's flame flared brightly, blinding her for a moment. When she could see again, the Watcher was no longer standing at the altar. Its form was gone, leaving only a swirling mass of shadows in its place. The room seemed to vibrate with an intense, unnatural energy, the walls groaning as if under immense pressure. "Sarah," Emily whispered, her voice trembling. "What have you done?" Before Sarah could respond, the ground beneath them began to shake violently, and the church started to collapse. "We need to get out," Sarah shouted, grabbing Emily's arm and pulling her toward the door. They ran, the walls of the church crumbling around them as they made their way to the exit. Just as they reached the doors, the entire building erupted in a deafening roar, a final explosive release of power. They stumbled out into the night, the ground shaking beneath their feet. Behind them, the church crumbled to dust, its ruins disintegrating into nothingness. For a moment, they stood in stunned silence, the weight of what had just happened sinking in. The watcher was gone, or so they thought. But as they looked back, the air grew still. The night was quiet. Too quiet. Did we really do it? Emily asked, her voice barely a whisper. Sarah didn't answer. She simply watched the stars above, feeling the weight of the silence pressing in on her. Somehow she knew this wasn't over. The night stretched on, colder than before, as Sarah and Emily stood in the quiet, snow-covered street. The destruction of the church was both a relief and a haunting realization. Had they truly ended the Watcher's reign, or was it only a temporary respite? The crumbling church behind them was proof of something monumental having occurred, yet the silence that followed felt unnerving. Sarah glanced up at the sky, her breath coming in shallow bursts as she tried to calm the wild beating of her heart. There were no more whispers, no more shadows. It almost felt like the world had stopped turning, waiting for something they couldn't yet understand. The events of the past few days seemed like a blur, a never-ending loop of fear, desperation, and fleeting victories. Yet deep down, Sarah knew this wasn't over. We should go back to your place, Emily said, her voice tight, clearly trying to shake the chill of fear that had settled over her. We need to rest, figure this out. It's too much, Sarah. Sarah didn't respond immediately, her eyes scanning the horizon. The stillness felt too strange, too perfect. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them, waiting. Yeah, she finally muttered, her voice distant. We should. As they walked away from the wreckage of the church, the unsettling silence seemed to grow thicker. Each step they took felt heavier, as though the ground itself was pulling them down. The quiet was no longer just an absence of sound, it was oppressive, like an invisible weight pressing in from every direction. When they arrived at Emily's apartment, the air inside was warm and safe. But for Sarah, it felt suffocating. The walls, the furniture, the small, quiet space, nothing seemed real anymore. All she could hear was the beating of her own pulse. We're safe here, Emily said, trying to comfort her, though Sarah could hear the uncertainty in her voice. But Sarah wasn't convinced. We shouldn't be here. This thing, it's never going to let us go. Emily's face paled, but she didn't argue. Instead, she sank onto the couch, her face drawn and tired. The toll of the past few days had taken its toll on both of them, physically and mentally. But Sarah couldn't rest, not yet. Let's just take a moment, Emily said, her voice soft. We'll figure it out. We need time to process everything. Sarah didn't want to sit. She didn't want to breathe. Every second felt like the calm before a storm, and it terrified her. But Emily was right. There was no other choice. They had to regroup. As the minutes passed, Sarah paced the room, her mind spinning. The Watcher was an entity of darkness, something beyond human comprehension. It had twisted and manipulated everything in its path, from the orphanage to the church. Its influence was everywhere, even now, in the air around them. Then, as if in response to her thoughts, a cold gust of wind swept through the room, the door creaking open without warning. Did you leave the window open? Emily asked, standing up suddenly. No, Sarah answered, her voice tight. She crossed the room in a few quick strides, peering out into the dark hallway beyond. There was no one there. The wind was gone just as quickly as it had come, but the unsettling feeling remained. Something was wrong, she could feel it in her bones. Sarah? Emily called from behind her, her voice shaking. Did you hear that? Sarah asked, not turning around. Emily's voice wavered with fear. No. What do you mean? Before Sarah could answer, the temperature in the room dropped again. This time it wasn't just the wind. It was as if something had filled the space with its cold presence. A bone-deep chill that made the hairs on the back of Sarah's neck stand up. It's here, Sarah whispered, her heart racing. She didn't have to say anything more. Emily had already started backing away, her eyes wide with fear. Sarah turned to face the window, knowing that whatever came next would be even worse than anything they'd faced before. The sound of soft, uneven footsteps echoed in the hallway. Someone, or something, was moving through the apartment. It's not real, Emily said, her voice high-pitched with panic. This isn't real. Emily, stop, Sarah snapped, her mind sharp despite the terror. It's here. The Watcher never left. The footsteps grew louder, coming closer with each passing second. Sarah didn't need to turn around to know that something was standing just behind her, watching, waiting. "Sarah?" Emily whispered, her voice barely audible. Before Sarah could respond, she felt a cold breath against her neck, sending a shiver of fear down her spine. Her heart skipped a beat as she turned, her body frozen in place. The Watcher was standing in the doorway. Its form was no longer just a shadow, it was solid, a dark, shapeless mass that seemed to distort the very air around it. The edges of its body blurred and twisted, as if it were being pulled in multiple directions at once. Its eyes gleamed with malice, two burning orbs of light that pierced the darkness of the room. "You think you can escape me?" it hissed, its voice like 1,000 whispers all merging into one. "You've only just begun to understand the depths of your mistake." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She couldn't move. The Watcher's presence filled every corner of the room, its dark energy suffocating her. But she wouldn't give in. Not now. With shaking hands, Sarah reached for the candle she'd held onto so tightly, the only weapon that had ever offered her any protection. It flickered weakly in her grasp, the flame fighting against the oppressive cold. The Watcher's grin widened, its teeth sharp and jagged. "You think that will stop me? You're nothing." "Shut up," Sarah spat, the words barely escaping her lips. She stepped forward, her hands trembling, but her resolve growing stronger with every moment. Emily gasped behind her. "What are you doing?" "I'm ending this," Sarah said, her voice a whisper but filled with fierce determination. The Watcher snarled, its form rippling and distorting as it reached out toward Sarah, its hand a mass of shadows that seemed to stretch impossibly far. But Sarah was ready. In one swift motion, she thrust the binding candle forward, the flame flaring brightly, pushing the darkness back. The room erupted in a burst of light, the Watcher's form flickering violently, its shrieks filling the air as it tried to retreat from the force of the candle's power. For a moment, everything was silent. Then, with a final gut-wrenching howl, the Watcher's form collapsed into nothingness. But Sarah knew this wasn't the end. The Watcher had been defeated, at least for now. But it was only a matter of time before it would rise again. The darkness never truly disappeared. It merely waited, biding its time until the next victim would stumble into its path. And Sarah was already wondering, how much longer could she keep running? The quiet was deafening. Sarah and Emily stood in the aftermath, the remnants of the Watcher's power still thick in the air. The shadows seemed to shift uneasily, but for now, the silence had returned. It was a silence that made Sarah's skin crawl, as if the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. "We did it," Emily whispered, her voice small, uncertain. But Sarah didn't feel the victory. The fear that had gripped her heart moments before hadn't loosened its hold. The Watcher's form had disappeared, but something inside her knew that whatever had been unleashed that night wasn't something that could be destroyed so easily. She shook her head, her eyes scanning the room again, as if expecting the Watcher to materialize from the walls themselves. "No, I don't think we did." Emily stepped forward, concern in her eyes. "What do you mean?" "It's gone, Sarah. We saw it. We defeated it." Sarah's gaze flicked to the window, where the snow was falling in thick, heavy flakes, blanketing the world in white. It seemed so peaceful outside, but that peacefulness was a lie. Nothing had been settled, not really. "I thought we could end it," Sarah muttered, almost to herself. "But it feels like we're just getting started." "Sarah?" Emily's voice wavered, her eyes wide with fear. "You're scaring me. It's over. We're safe now." "No, we're not," Sarah replied, her voice sharp, her hand instinctively gripping the binding candle tighter. "The Watcher wasn't just a thing. It's a force. It feeds on fear, on chaos, and we just set it free. Do you understand? It's not gone. It's waiting. Waiting for the next time we let our guard down." Emily shook her head, her face pale. "You can't be serious. After everything, after the church, we're still not free?" Sarah turned away, her back to Emily as she walked across the room, her mind racing. She had always known deep down that there was more to this story than they had been able to see. The Watcher had been pulling strings for years, manipulating events, drawing people to its influence. It was never just about the church or the town, it was something bigger, something older. And no matter how many battles they fought, it would keep coming back, stronger each time. "The Watcher isn't just one entity," Sarah said, her voice distant, barely a whisper. "It's part of something much older. something much darker. Emily stepped closer, trying to understand. What are you talking about? Are you saying we're still in danger? Sarah turned to face her, her eyes dark with realization. Yes, I think the Watcher was a fragment of something much larger, a creature that's been feeding off fear for centuries, maybe longer. It's not a ghost or a demon or a spirit. It's something older, primal. Emily's face paled even further. Then what do we do? How do we stop it for good? Sarah's eyes locked onto hers, her mind racing for answers she didn't have. I don't know, but I think we have to understand what we're really up against. We need to find out what it really is, how it works. Emily seemed to hesitate before speaking. What if we can't stop it? What if it's too powerful for us? Sarah hesitated, the weight of her thoughts pressing down on her. I don't know, but we have no choice. We can't just walk away from this, Emily. It'll keep coming. It won't stop. They both stood in the quiet room, the weight of the words hanging heavily between them. The fear wasn't gone. It wasn't even fading. It was growing stronger with every moment they spent in this suffocating silence. The doorbell rang. The sound sliced through the air like a knife. Both Sarah and Emily froze. There was no one who should have been coming. No one else was supposed to be there. The time for visitors had long passed. Who is it? Emily asked, voice trembling. I don't know, Sarah whispered, her heart hammering in her chest. She knew it wasn't just an ordinary visitor. Whoever it was, they had to be connected to everything that was happening. It was too much of a coincidence. The doorbell rang again, this time more urgently. Sarah, Emily breathed, her voice filled with dread. You think it's back? I don't know, Sarah said, stepping slowly toward the door. The flickering candlelight cast long, unsettling shadows on the walls as she approached, each step feeling like it took her deeper into some unseen danger. She reached for the doorknob. The air was heavy with tension. Every instinct told her to open it, to face whatever waited on the other side. But fear held her back. What if it wasn't the Watcher? What if it was something worse? With a trembling hand, she twisted the knob. The door creaked open. Standing on the other side was a figure. Not the Watcher, this time it was a man. A stranger. His features were sharp, his expression unreadable, but there was something off about him. His eyes gleamed with an unnatural intensity, and his gaze never wavered as it met Sarah's. I think we need to talk, the man said, his voice low and calm as though he had been expecting her. For a moment, neither Sarah nor Emily spoke. They just stared at the man, confusion and fear bubbling up inside them. Sarah's heart thudded in her chest, and an icy shiver ran down her spine. There was something wrong with him. Who are you? Emily asked, her voice small but steady, standing behind Sarah. The man didn't answer right away. Instead, his eyes seemed to study them both as if weighing their every move. Then finally he spoke. You've been trying to stop something you don't understand, he said softly. But you're too late. The Watcher is only one part of a much larger story. And now the end begins. The words hung in the air like a heavy fog, their meaning sinking into Sarah's chest. The end? What was he talking about? What did this man know? You're not alone in this, the man continued, his voice never changing in tone. But you can't stop it. Not now. Not anymore. The door slammed shut. The quiet was deafening. Sarah and Emily stood in the aftermath, the remnants of the Watcher's power still thick in the air. The shadows seemed to shift uneasily, but for now, the silence had returned. It was a silence that made Sarah's skin crawl, as if the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. We did it, Emily whispered, her voice small, uncertain. But Sarah didn't feel the victory. The fear that had gripped her heart moments before hadn't loosened its hold. The Watcher's form had disappeared, but something inside her knew that whatever had been unleashed that night wasn't something that could be destroyed so easily. She shook her head, her eyes scanning the room again, as if expecting the Watcher to materialize from the walls themselves. No, I don't think we did. Emily stepped forward, concern in her eyes. What do you mean? It's gone, Sarah. We saw it. We defeated it. Sarah's gaze flicked to the window, where the snow was falling in thick, heavy flakes, blanketing the world in white. It seemed so peaceful outside, but that peacefulness was a lie. Nothing had been settled, not really. I thought we could end it, Sarah muttered, almost to herself. But it feels like we're just getting started. Sarah, Emily's voice wavered, her eyes wide with fear. You're scaring me. It's over. We're safe now. No, we're not, Sarah replied, her voice sharp, her hand instinctively gripping the binding candle tighter. The Watcher wasn't just a thing. It's a force. It feeds on fear, on chaos, and we just set it free. Do you understand? It's not gone. It's waiting. Waiting for the next time we let our guard down. Emily shook her head, her face pale. You can't be serious. After everything, after the church, we're still not free? Sarah turned away, her back to Emily as she walked across the room, her mind racing. She had always known deep down that there was more to this story than they had been able to see. The Watcher had been pulling strings for years, manipulating events, drawing people to its influence. It was never just about the church or the town. It was something bigger, something older. And no matter how many battles they fought, it would keep coming back, stronger each time. The Watcher isn't just one entity, Sarah said, her voice distant, barely a whisper. It's part of something much older, something much darker. Emily stepped closer, trying to understand. What are you talking about? Are you saying we're still in danger? Sarah turned to face her, her eyes dark with realization. Yes, I think the Watcher was a fragment of something much larger, a creature that's been feeding off fear for centuries, maybe longer. It's not a ghost or a demon or a spirit. It's something older, primal. Emily's face paled even further. Then what do we do? How do we stop it for good? Sarah's eyes locked onto hers, her mind racing for answers she didn't have. I don't know, but I think we have to understand what we're really up against. We need to find out what it really is, how it works. Emily seemed to hesitate before speaking. What if we can't stop it? What if it's too powerful for us? Sarah hesitated, the weight of her thoughts pressing down on her. I don't know, but we have no choice. We can't just walk away from this, Emily. It'll keep coming. It won't stop. They both stood in the quiet room, the weight of the words hanging heavily between them. The fear wasn't gone. It wasn't even fading. It was growing stronger with every moment they spent in this suffocating silence. The doorbell rang. The sound sliced through the air like a knife. Both Sarah and Emily froze. There was no one who should have been coming. No one else was supposed to be there. The time for visitors had long passed. Who is it? Emily asked, voice trembling. I don't know, Sarah whispered, her heart hammering in her chest. She knew it wasn't just an ordinary visitor. Whoever it was, they had to be connected to everything that was happening. It was too much of a coincidence. The doorbell rang again, this time more urgently. Sarah, Emily breathed, her voice filled with dread. You think it's back? I don't know, Sarah said, stepping slowly toward the door. The flickering candlelight cast long, unsettling shadows on the walls as she approached, each step feeling like it took her deeper into some unseen danger. She reached for the doorknob. The air was heavy with tension. Every instinct told her to open it, to face whatever waited on the other side. But fear held her back. What if it wasn't the Watcher? What if it was something worse? With a trembling hand, she twisted the knob. The door creaked open. Standing on the other side was a figure. Not the Watcher, this time it was a man. A stranger. His features were sharp, his expression unreadable, but there was something off about him. His eyes gleamed with an unnatural intensity, and his gaze never wavered as it met Sarah's. I think we need to talk, the man said, his voice low and calm as though he had been expecting her. For a moment, neither Sarah nor Emily spoke. They just stared at the man, confusion and fear bubbling up inside them. Sarah's heart thudded in her chest, and an icy shiver ran down her spine. There was something wrong with him. Who are you? Emily asked, her voice small but steady, standing behind Sarah. The man didn't answer right away. Instead, his eyes seemed to study them both as if weighing their every move. Then finally he spoke. You've been trying to stop something you don't understand, he said softly. But you're too late. The Watcher is only one part of a much larger story. And now the end begins. The words hung in the air like a heavy fog, their meaning sinking into Sarah's chest. The end? What was he talking about? What did this man know? You're not alone in this, the man continued, his voice never changing in tone. But you can't stop it. Not now. Not anymore. The door slammed shut. The air around Sarah grew thick with the man's final words, which seemed to echo in her mind even after the door slammed shut. The end begins. Her hands were trembling, but her body was still rooted to the floor. Emily was standing just behind her, eyes wide, face pale, but Sarah couldn't bring herself to turn around and meet her gaze. The room felt suffocating, like it was closing in on her from every side. Everything, the calmness of the snow outside, the silence inside, felt like an illusion, a fragile mask that was about to crack. They stood there in the dim light of the candle, as the moment stretched into an eternity. The weight of the man's words hovered between them, unspoken but undeniable. It was as if everything they had done, every effort they had made to defeat the Watcher, had been in vain. And the terror that followed that realization was enough to make Sarah's knees buckle. Emily was the first to speak, her voice a strained whisper. "Sarah, what did he mean? What was that about the end?" Sarah didn't answer right away. She couldn't. Her mind was racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The man had come from nowhere. There was no way he could have known what they had been through unless he had been watching them the entire time. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to speak. "I don't know, Emily, but I think he's right. We've been chasing shadows, trying to stop something that's too big for us." Emily's voice faltered, but she stepped forward, her determination clear despite the fear. "No, Sarah. We've made it this far. We can't just give up now. We have to fight, right? We've come this far." "But we're out of options," Sarah interrupted, her voice harsh and filled with exhaustion. She could feel the weight of everything pressing down on her, the years of fear and struggle, and now the realization that they had reached the point of no return. Emily shook her head vehemently, tears threatening to spill from her eyes. "That's not true. You've been the one leading us. You've been the one to keep us going. We can't just stop now. We can't let it win." "I don't know how much more I can take," Sarah said, her voice quieter now, strained. "Every time we think we've won, it's just another trap. The Watcher, whatever it is, it's too powerful. It's playing a game with us and we're losing." The silence that followed was unbearable. Sarah's mind was spinning, torn between the will to fight and the overwhelming sense of futility that pressed against her chest. She knew she couldn't give up, not when Emily was depending on her, but every instinct told her that they were teetering on the edge of something far darker than they could comprehend. "Do you think he's one of them?" Emily's voice was small now, barely above a whisper. "The man who came to the door. He didn't seem right? Like he knew too much." Sarah didn't know how to answer that. The man had spoken with an eerie calmness, as though everything they were experiencing was part of a much larger plan. He had said the end was beginning, and that chilling thought gnawed at Sarah's every waking moment. "I don't know," she said finally, "but I don't think he's here to help us." A sharp knock on the door interrupted their conversation, making both women jump. Sarah's heart leapt in her chest, and her breath hitched in her throat. The man, had he come back? Was it someone else? "I thought we were alone," Emily muttered, her voice tight with fear. "We are," Sarah replied, though she wasn't sure she believed her own words. "No one else should be here." Another knock, this time more forceful. Sarah hesitated. Every instinct screamed at her to stay away from the door, but she couldn't just ignore it. With shaky hands, she stepped toward the door. The air felt different, heavier, as though the world itself had changed since that last visit. As she reached for the doorknob, the sound of her own pulse thundered in her ears, drowning out everything else. She could feel the weight of the unknown pressing in, and she knew that once that door opened, everything would change. "Sarah, please don't," Emily whispered from behind her, but Sarah could hear the fear in her voice. "What if it's him? What if it's a trap?" "I have to," Sarah said quietly, the words slipping from her mouth before she could stop them. She wasn't sure if she was convincing Emily or herself. Slowly, she twisted the doorknob, her hand trembling as the door creaked open. The sight that greeted her on the other side made her blood run cold. Standing in front of her was a woman, young, but with an unnatural stillness about her. Her skin was pale, almost as if she hadn't seen the sun in years. Her long, dark hair was tangled and matted, her eyes wide and empty. "Can I help you?" Sarah asked, her voice more steady than she felt, though her mind was screaming to shut the door. The woman didn't answer immediately. She only stared at Sarah with those wide, unblinking eyes. The silence between them grew thick, charged with an unspoken tension. Then finally she spoke. "He's coming," she said, her voice low and hollow as if the words didn't belong to her. "Who?" Sarah demanded, her pulse quickening. "The one who controls it all. The Watcher is just a shadow. The real power? Before she could finish, the woman's head jerked back as if an invisible force was pulling her. Her body contorted unnaturally, a horrific cracking sound filling the air as her arms and legs bent in ways that no human body should. In a split second, the woman was gone, disappeared into thin air. Sarah stared, frozen. The door swung open wider in the wind, and she saw the familiar emptiness of the hallway beyond. "Did you see that?" Emily breathed, her voice trembling in disbelief. Sarah didn't answer. She couldn't. The woman had spoken of something worse than the Watcher itself. Someone or something controlling it all. And whatever it was coming. There was no more time to waste. "We need to leave," Sarah said, her voice sharp with urgency. "It's not safe here anymore. We can't wait for it to find us." But Emily didn't move. She was staring at the empty doorway, the fear now a palpable force between them. "Where do we go?" Emily asked, voice breaking. Sarah didn't have an answer. She only knew one thing for certain. Whatever was coming, they couldn't outrun it. Not anymore. The end was coming, and this time there was no escape. The wind outside had picked up, howling like a banshee, rattling the windows and shaking the walls of the small house. But it wasn't the storm that made Sarah's heart race. No, it was the suffocating silence inside. The same silence that had felt so ominous moments before, now stretched across the room like a thick, suffocating blanket. Each breath Sarah took felt heavier than the last. The fear that had gripped her chest had turned into something worse, something that was settling deep into her bones, making her feel like she could never escape. Emily was still standing frozen, staring at the door as though expecting something to burst through at any second. Her eyes were wide, her mouth slightly open, but no words came out. She was terrified, and Sarah knew she wasn't far behind her. The woman who had appeared on the doorstep, what had she been? Was she real? Was it another trick? "Sarah," Emily whispered, voice barely audible, "what was that?" "I don't know," Sarah replied, her voice rough, the words tasting bitter in her mouth. "I don't know what it means, but I feel it, that thing, whatever it is, it's coming for us." Emily looked up at her, her expression torn between disbelief and terror. But what if we're already too late? What if we can't stop it now?" Sarah didn't answer. The truth was, she didn't know what to do anymore. The Watcher, the man at the door, the woman who had vanished into thin air, it all felt like pieces of a puzzle she couldn't put together. All she knew was that whatever force they were facing was closing in, and it was getting stronger. "Sarah," Emily said again, her voice a little stronger this time. "Where do we go? What do we do?" For a long time, Sarah didn't speak. The silence between them stretched, and for a moment, she just listened to the wind outside, the howling of the storm growing louder, more insistent. Then the answer came to her, not in the form of a plan, but in the form of a feeling. It was a deep, instinctual knowing that this was no longer something they could fight with logic or courage alone. This was something older, something primal, and they were in the midst of a battle they couldn't fully comprehend. But there had to be a way to survive. There had to be something they could do to stop it. "We need to find the source," Sarah said, her voice steady now, though it was tinged with the faintest edge of desperation. "Whatever is controlling the Watcher, it's somewhere. It's not just here, not just in this town. We need to find it before it finds us." Emily's eyes were wide, and for a moment, Sarah saw a flash of panic in them. "But how? Where do we even start?" "We start by getting out of here," Sarah said, her decision final. "We're not safe here anymore. We can't wait around for it to come to us." Emily hesitated, but then nodded. She grabbed her jacket from the couch, and the two of them stood there for a moment, their eyes meeting in silent understanding. This was no longer a matter of fighting or confronting something they could handle, it was survival. Sarah took a deep breath and turned toward the door. She reached for the handle, her heart pounding in her chest. But before she could open it, a noise echoed from the other side. A faint scratching sound like something, or someone, was trying to get in. Sarah froze, her hand still on the door. The sound grew louder, more frantic, and then came the unmistakable sound of something heavy hitting the door from the other side. "Sarah," Emily whispered, stepping closer, her breath shallow. "What is that? Who's out there?" But Sarah didn't answer. She couldn't. Her thoughts were racing. They had to leave, but it was too late. Whatever it was that was behind the door wasn't just a person. It was something far worse. The door rattled again, and Sarah backed away instinctively. The terror in her chest threatened to overtake her, but she fought to keep control. "Get back," Sarah whispered urgently, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her. "Get away from the door." Emily moved quickly, stepping back toward the far wall of the living room. Sarah stood frozen, her hands still gripped tightly around the doorknob. Then the door suddenly gave way, crashing open with a violent force. A figure stood in the doorway. Not the man, not the woman, the figure was different. It was taller, its face obscured by shadows. For a moment, Sarah couldn't see its features, but she could feel its presence, the overwhelming weight of something that should not be. And then the voice. It was low, guttural, barely a whisper, but it reverberated in the room like 1,000 voices speaking at once. "You cannot escape," it said, its voice like a scraping, tearing sound. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. The words seemed to hang in the air, clinging to her like a cloud of suffocating fog. The figure took a step forward, and Sarah's legs felt like they might give out beneath her. She backed away instinctively, her hand still clutching the binding candle, which now felt like nothing more than a useless trinket in her palm. But the figure didn't move closer. Instead, it spoke again, this time with a chilling calmness. "The Watcher is just the beginning," it said. "The real game has only just started." Before Sarah could respond, the figure faded into the shadows, disappearing as quickly as it had appeared. The door slammed shut, leaving an unsettling silence in its wake. For a long moment, neither Sarah nor Emily moved. The storm outside had intensified, its howling winds now mingling with the eerie silence inside. Sarah's heart was racing, her body trembling, but she forced herself to breathe slowly to steady herself. They know we're here," Emily said, her voice barely above a whisper. "They're not going to stop, are they?" Sarah shook her head slowly. "No, I don't think they will." Her mind raced. The Watcher, the man at the door, the woman who vanished, the figure who had just spoken to them. It was all connected in ways she couldn't yet understand. But one thing was clear, the game wasn't over. It had only just begun. They couldn't stay here. They had to leave. But they couldn't outrun what was coming for them. Not anymore. "Where do we go now?" Emily asked, her voice shaking with fear. Sarah paused. There were no answers, no places they could hide. Only one thought seemed to keep repeating in her mind. Asterisk, they have to find the source before it finds them, asterisk. But where? Oh. The wind outside screamed louder, and Sarah's gaze flickered to the window. It was no longer just a storm. It was a warning. The real storm was coming, and it wasn't going to be something they could escape from. The hours passed in a blur. Sarah didn't know if it was the overwhelming fear or the constant pounding in her head, but time seemed to stretch and bend in ways that made everything feel wrong. The house, once a sanctuary from the chaos outside, had turned into something far darker. The walls felt like they were closing in. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustling noise in the wind, made her jump in terror. There was no escaping the feeling that they were being hunted, tracked by something that saw them as nothing more than prey. Emily hadn't spoken much since the figure had disappeared. She was silent, her face pale, her eyes constantly scanning the shadows, searching for something that might emerge at any moment. Sarah didn't know what to say either. Words felt useless in a world that was crumbling beneath them. All she could think about was that voice, the voice that had spoken to them from the doorway, and the chilling words that had followed. The real game has only just started. The Watcher, the mysterious figure, everything was leading up to something bigger. Sarah could feel it deep in her gut. This wasn't just a random series of horrors. There was a purpose to all of this. Someone or something had orchestrated it all, and they were too small, too insignificant to stop it. They had walked into this game without understanding the rules. And now the game was spiraling out of control. Sarah sat at the small kitchen table, her hands wrapped tightly around the mug of cold coffee in front of her. She hadn't been able to drink it, but the weight of it in her hands gave her something to focus on, something to ground her. Emily had gone quiet again, staring out the window into the snow-covered night, her eyes distant, haunted. "How much longer do you think we can last?" Emily asked suddenly, her voice trembling. Sarah didn't answer right away. She didn't know how long they could last. But one thing was certain. The longer they stayed, the closer the danger crept. They couldn't outrun it forever. Eventually, it would catch up with them. It always did. The question was, where could they run to? "Until we find the source," Sarah finally said, her voice steady, even though doubt gnawed at her. "Until we figure out what it wants, we have to keep moving." Emily looked at her, eyes wide. But how do we even begin to figure that out? We don't know where to look, Sarah. I know, Sarah muttered, her mind racing. But we have to try. We can't just sit here and wait for it to come for us. She stood up abruptly, her chair scraping harshly against the floor, the noise a jarring reminder of how fragile everything had become. We'll leave. We'll search for anything that might help us. There has to be something, anything, out there. Emily stared at her for a long moment, her face unreadable. Then she nodded slowly, though the fear in her eyes never fully left. They didn't have a plan, not really. There was no map, no guide to show them where they needed to go or what they needed to do. They were grasping at straws, trying to piece together fragments of a nightmare. And yet, Sarah couldn't sit idle any longer. If they were going to survive, they had to at least try to find an answer. They gathered what little they could, packing their belongings into a bag, water, food, the candle that had once been their only hope. Sarah's mind was a blur of uncertainty as she moved through the motions, but one thing was clear: they were leaving. They couldn't stay here anymore. The house had been their prison for too long. It was time to break free, even if they didn't know what awaited them outside. The door slammed open with a rush of cold air as they stepped outside, and Sarah shivered as the icy wind whipped around them. The snowstorm had intensified, the white landscape stretching out in every direction. The night seemed endless, the world swallowed up by the dark. The house behind them, once a place of refuge, was now just a distant silhouette in the storm. There was no turning back. Where do we go? Emily asked, voice barely audible over the wind. Sarah didn't know the answer. The town they were in had been their starting point, but now, it felt like a graveyard, a place suffocated by its own secrets. The figure, the one who had spoken to them, had warned them that the real game had begun. But where was the finish line? How could they find it when everything around them seemed to be a labyrinth of nightmares? There's a place, Sarah said suddenly, her voice sharp with a newfound sense of determination. A church outside of town. I've heard rumors about it. People say it's connected to things. Things like the Watcher. Emily turned to her, confused. A church? But what does it have to do with all this? I don't know, Sarah admitted, but it's the only lead we have. If there's even a chance it's connected, we have to check it out. They started walking, their footsteps muffled by the thick layer of snow beneath them. The wind howled, and Sarah could feel the weight of the storm pressing down on them. But she couldn't stop now. The further they went, the more determined she became. The idea of finding something, anything, that might give them a way out was the only thing keeping her moving. As they walked, the darkness seemed to close in around them. The only light came from the flickering glow of the candle, the small flame barely cutting through the blackness. It felt like the world had been drained of all color, all life, and all that remained was the cold, the storm, and the weight of whatever was following them. Suddenly, a voice echoed through the storm. Not a voice from behind, but a voice from ahead. A low, guttural whisper that made Sarah's blood run cold. You think you can outrun me? The words seemed to hang in the air, their meaning sending a jolt of terror through Sarah's veins. She turned sharply, but there was no one there. Just the endless expanse of snow, the wind howling as if mocking her. Sarah, did you hear that? Emily whispered, her face pale, eyes wide. Sarah nodded, her heart racing. She hadn't imagined it. The voice had been real. But there was no one to be seen, nothing to explain the sound. It had come from all around them, an invisible force, lingering just out of reach. They continued to walk, the unease growing with every step. The storm had become unbearable, and soon, it felt like they were moving through an endless blur of white and gray. The church had to be close. She could feel it, feel the pull toward it as if something was guiding her. But with each passing moment, the air grew thicker, the whispers louder. They're here, Sarah muttered under her breath, almost to herself. What do you mean? Emily asked, her voice trembling. They're watching, Sarah said, her voice filled with a deep, almost hollow certainty. They're always watching. And then, just ahead, through the blizzard, Sarah saw it. The church. It stood like a dark silhouette against the storm, its tall spires reaching up into the night sky like the fingers of some ancient god, its windows dark and empty. But it wasn't empty. She could feel it. Something was waiting inside. The end was near, but Sarah knew this much. The real horror wasn't the Watcher. It was whatever lay inside that church. And she was about to find out exactly what that was. The church loomed in front of them, dark and imposing, as if it had been waiting for them all along. The wind howled around the two women, biting through their clothing and freezing their bones, but they could neither feel nor care about the cold. All that mattered was what lay beyond the church's heavy wooden doors. Sarah's pulse quickened, each beat like a drum in her ears, as her eyes traced the church's outline against the storm. She could feel something deep in her chest, a presence. It wasn't just the building. It was something more, something ancient and predatory, stretching out into the darkness like invisible tendrils, reaching for them. "Are you sure this is the right place?" Emily whispered, her voice barely audible over the gale. Sarah didn't answer immediately. She couldn't. The words stuck in her throat, and for a long moment she just stood there, staring at the doors. The same doors that had been part of the nightmare all along. The doors that had been waiting for her to open them. "Yes," Sarah finally whispered, her voice raw. "It has to be." She pushed forward, her feet crunching in the thick snow as she approached the doors, her hand trembling as it reached for the worn brass handle. The cold metal bit at her skin, and the door groaned as she slowly pulled it open. The air that escaped from inside wasn't warm, but it wasn't cold either. It was thick with something else, something that Sarah couldn't quite place, but it made her blood run cold nonetheless. The inside of the church was just as she had imagined it would be, dark, empty, and eerily quiet. The walls, adorned with fading paintings and old wooden beams, seemed to sag under the weight of centuries of secrets. The stained glass windows, once vibrant, were now shattered in places, the jagged shards casting strange patterns of light onto the floor as the wind howled through the broken panes. But it wasn't the church's decay that held her in place. It was the feeling, the oppressive sense that something was watching, something was waiting for them, hidden in the shadows. "Do you feel that?" Emily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Sarah nodded. She could feel it too, that heavy presence hanging in the air like a dark fog. As they stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind them with a deafening bang, the sound echoing through the hollow space, and the two women froze. There was no going back now. "Sarah," Emily began, her voice tight with fear. "What now? What are we supposed to do here?" Sarah didn't know. The fear that had been gnawing at her for days was now a full-blown terror, settling deep in her chest. They had come here hoping for answers, hoping to find the source of the terror that had been chasing them, but what if this was a mistake? What if there was no escaping what was coming for them? "I don't know," Sarah admitted, her voice shaky. "But we have to try." The air grew heavier with each passing second, and Sarah's eyes darted around, searching for any clue, any sign of what they were supposed to do. Her hand instinctively reached for the candle in her pocket. It had been their only hope for so long, but now, it felt like nothing more than a futile gesture. There was no magic to save them, no spell that would make all of this go away. Suddenly the silence broke. A loud crash rang out from the far side of the church, followed by the unmistakable sound of something, or someone, moving through the shadows. The hairs on the back of Sarah's neck stood on end, and her heart began to race. She couldn't see anything, but she could feel it. Something was there, just out of sight, and it was getting closer. Emily's breath hitched, and Sarah turned to her, her eyes wide with fear. But before either of them could speak, a voice, low, guttural, and familiar, came from the shadows. "You shouldn't have come here." Sarah's blood ran cold at the sound of the voice. It was the same voice, the one that had echoed through the storm outside. The same voice that had sent chills down her spine every time it had spoken. From the darkness the figure emerged. Tall, shrouded in a cloak of shadows, its features hidden beneath the dark folds of its hood. It moved with an unnatural grace, as though it wasn't truly part of this world, and its presence seemed to twist the very air around it. "You think you can escape?" it asked, its voice dripping with disdain. "You think you can run from me?" Sarah stepped back, her heart racing. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and defiance. "What do you want from us?" The figure's head tilted slightly, as though considering the question. Then it spoke again, its voice colder than ever. "What do I want? I want you to understand. I want you to understand that there is no escaping fate. You are part of the game now, and you will play it until the end. The Watcher was just the beginning, the first move. You thought you could fight it, but now you're mine." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow, knocking the wind out of her. The reality of what it was saying settled over her like a dark cloud. She had thought they were fighting against some malicious force, some evil entity. But it wasn't just an entity, it was part of something bigger, something far more insidious. "Please," Emily whispered, her voice cracking with fear. "We didn't ask for this. We didn't choose this." The figure let out a low, mocking laugh. "You never had a choice. No one ever does. You're just pieces on a board, playing the game whether you want to or not." Suddenly, the figure raised its arm, and a dark light pulsed from its hand, swirling around the room like a storm, engulfing everything in its path. The shadows stretched and twisted, and Sarah could feel the darkness closing in, swallowing the church whole. "No!" Sarah shouted, her voice full of desperation. She pulled the candle from her pocket and lit it, the small flame flickering weakly against the overwhelming darkness. The figure paused, as if it had been momentarily surprised by her action. But then the shadows intensified, the darkness swirling faster, becoming more oppressive. It was as if the very air was choking them, pulling them into an abyss from which there would be no return. "You think that will stop me?" the figure hissed, its voice filled with contempt. But then something unexpected happened. The flame of the candle grew brighter, expanding in a burst of pure light that illuminated the entire church. The shadows recoiled, retreating from the light as if they couldn't bear to touch it. "Now you understand," the figure said, its voice growing weaker. "The light always fights back." With a final, defeated hiss, the figure crumbled into the darkness, vanishing without a trace. The storm outside howled one last time, and then all was silent. For a long moment, neither Sarah nor Emily moved. They were too stunned, too terrified to process what had just happened. The church was empty now, save for the cold, the wind, and the faint glow of the candle. Sarah's heart was still pounding, but the overwhelming weight of fear seemed to lift, replaced by a hollow feeling that gnawed at her from the inside. They had won for now, but the game was not over. They knew that. The figure had said it themselves. The Watcher had been just the beginning. And as Sarah stared at the flickering candle in her hand, she knew this wasn't the end. The real horror had yet to reveal itself. And somewhere deep in the shadows it was waiting. Story 2. The snow outside had started hours ago, soft and innocent at first, but now it fell in relentless waves, blanketing every inch of Pine Street in a pristine white silence. For Sarah, it should have been the kind of picturesque winter night she dreamed of, a postcard-perfect Christmas Eve. The warm lights of her home glowed against the icy chill outside, and inside, everything was as it should be, or so it seemed. She glanced out the living room window, watching her husband, Mike, adjust the last set of string lights on the front porch. He was meticulous as always, stepping back and narrowing his eyes to make sure every bulb lined up perfectly. She couldn't help but smile, pulling her cardigan tighter around her shoulders as the faint strains of Silent Night played on the old record player. But then something caught her attention. Just beyond the reach of their porch lights, in the shadows where the snow was falling heavier, a figure stood motionless. It was hard to make out through the frost-covered window, but it wasn't her imagination. Someone was there. "Mike," she called softly, her voice catching in her throat. Mike turned, holding the ladder steady. "What is it?" She pointed, careful not to make any sudden movements. "Over there, at the edge of the yard." Mike squinted into the darkness, his brow furrowing. "I don't see anything, Sarah. Probably just a tree or something." But it wasn't a tree. Sarah was sure of it. The figure hadn't moved an inch, and something about its posture, so rigid, so wrong, made her skin crawl. Still, Mike brushed it off and came inside a few minutes later, stomping the snow off his boots. "You're imagining things," he said with a chuckle, kissing her on the forehead. She wanted to believe him, but as she turned to glance out the window again, the figure was gone. Dinner was a simple affair. Their 8-year-old daughter, Emily, sat at the table, her face glowing with excitement as she rattled off her list of things she hoped Santa would bring. Sarah listened half-heartedly, her thoughts still lingering on the figure in the yard. That's when the first strange thing happened. The snow globe. It had been sitting on the mantel since the day Sarah inherited it from her grandmother. A delicate piece, its glass casing holding a tiny winter wonderland inside. A Victorian house surrounded by trees with a little boy and his dog playing in the snow. Sarah had always found it comforting, a little piece of her childhood she could hold on to. But now as they ate, the snow globe suddenly shattered. It didn't fall. It didn't roll. It simply cracked apart, the sound like ice breaking underfoot. Everyone froze. "What the—" Mike stood, looking at the pieces scattered across the floor. "How did that happen?" Sarah's heart was racing. "It's been up there for years. It's never even moved." Emily was the first to speak. "It wasn't me," she said quickly, her voice trembling. "No one said it was, honey," Sarah replied, trying to keep calm. But she could feel the unease spreading through the room like a draft. Mike cleaned up the glass, muttering something about how old things tend to break, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't normal. And then, as if to confirm her fears, the lights flickered. Not just in the living room, but throughout the entire house. Emily screamed, clutching her mother's arm. "Mommy, what's happening?" Probably the storm, Mike said, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. I'll check the fuse box. As he disappeared down the basement stairs, the house plunged into an unnatural quiet. The kind of quiet that felt alive, pressing against Sarah's ears until she swore she could hear her own heartbeat. And then the knocking started. It wasn't loud, but it was deliberate. 3 sharp knocks at the front door, each one sending a jolt through Sarah's chest. "Mike," she called, but he didn't answer. Emily clung to her tighter. "Don't open it, Mommy." "I won't," Sarah whispered, though her feet were already moving toward the door. She peered through the peephole, her breath fogging up the glass. No one was there. But as she opened the door cautiously, just a crack, she saw it. Lying in the fresh snow was a single ornament, a small, cracked bauble, its once bright colors now faded and dull. Her breath caught in her throat. She recognized it instantly. It was part of the set she'd thrown away years ago after the accident. "No," she whispered, stepping back. "This isn't possible." "What is it, Mommy?" Emily asked, her voice trembling. Sarah slammed the door shut, locking it and double-checking the latch. "Nothing, sweetheart. Just stay with me." But her mind was racing. Who had left the ornament? And how had they found it? From the basement, she heard Mike's voice echo faintly. "Sarah? Are you up there?" "Yes," she called back, relief flooding her chest. But then came the second knock. And this time it wasn't at the front door. It was coming from inside the house. The knock echoed through the silent house, louder and closer than before. Sarah froze in place, her hand still clutching the door lock. Emily whimpered softly, burying her face into Sarah's side. "Mike," Sarah called out, her voice trembling. She prayed he would answer, prayed he'd say he was playing some ill-timed joke, even though she knew Mike wasn't the kind to do that. But all she heard in response was the hum of the basement light bulb faintly buzzing from below. The knock came again, this time with more force. It sounded like it was coming from the hallway closet, the one just off the kitchen. Emily clung tighter. "Mommy, what is it? Who's in the house?" Sarah didn't know how to answer. She swallowed hard, her throat dry as sandpaper. "It's nothing, sweetheart," she lied, trying to keep her voice steady. "Stay right here." Emily shook her head violently. "No, don't leave me." "Okay," Sarah whispered, pulling her daughter closer. "We'll stay together." She grabbed the fireplace poker from the hearth, the metal cold and heavy in her hand. Step by step, she moved toward the kitchen, her pulse pounding so hard it drowned out all other sounds. The hallway closet door was shut, but there was no mistaking the source of the noise now. The knocking was rhythmic, steady, and too deliberate to be anything but human. Or was it? "Who's there?" Sarah demanded, her voice barely more than a whisper. No answer. She took a step closer. The floor creaked under her weight, and as if in response, the knocking stopped. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She stood frozen, staring at the door. The silence felt worse than the noise. "Mommy?" Emily's small voice pulled her attention back for a moment. "It's okay," Sarah said softly, though she wasn't sure if she believed her own words. And then the door handle moved. It wasn't just a twitch. It turned all the way as though someone on the other side was trying to open it. But the closet door was locked from the outside. Sarah's breath hitched. She raised the fireplace poker, gripping it so tightly her knuckles turned white. "Mike!" she screamed this time, desperation overtaking fear. Still no response from the basement. Emily was sobbing now, her tiny hands gripping Sarah's sweater. The door handle rattled again, harder this time. Sarah couldn't wait any longer. She stepped forward and swung the poker with all her strength, smashing it against the door. The wood splintered slightly but held firm. The rattling stopped. For a moment, the house was still again, save for the sound of Sarah's ragged breathing. And then from behind the door came a whisper. "Sarah?" The voice was faint, barely audible, but it sent ice down her spine. It wasn't Mike's voice. It wasn't anyone she recognized. She backed away, clutching Emily close. Her instinct screamed to run, but her feet wouldn't move. The whisper came again, louder this time. "Sarah, why did you forget us?" Tears blurred her vision. "Who's there? What do you want?" But the voice didn't answer. Instead, the closet door burst open with a force that sent Sarah stumbling backward. Inside there was no one. Just the faint scent of something old and rotting, like damp earth and decaying wood. And sitting on the closet floor, perfectly centered, was another ornament from the same set. This one wasn't cracked. It was pristine, its red and gold surface gleaming as if it had been freshly polished. Sarah stared at it, her mind racing. "This isn't real," she muttered to herself. "This can't be real." "Mommy?" Emily's voice was a terrified whisper. "It's okay," Sarah said again, though she didn't believe it. She reached out cautiously, her fingers brushing the surface of the ornament. It was ice cold, far colder than it should have been. The moment she touched it, the lights in the house went out. Total darkness swallowed them, and Emily screamed. Sarah pulled her close, her free hand gripping the poker once more. "Mike," she shouted again, her voice echoing in the pitch-black silence. Footsteps thudded from the basement. Heavy, deliberate steps coming closer and closer. Finally, a flashlight beam cut through the darkness as Mike emerged at the top of the stairs. "Sarah? What's going on?" She didn't answer right away, too shaken to find the words. Mike frowned, shining the light toward the open closet. "What happened here? Why's the door broken?" Sarah hesitated, glancing back at Emily. She didn't want to scare her daughter any more than she already was. "There was someone in the house," she said finally. Mike's face hardened. He stepped toward the closet, his flashlight illuminating the empty space inside. "There's no one here. Are you sure you didn't just hear things?" Sarah pointed to the ornament on the floor. "Then how do you explain that?" Mike crouched down, picking it up. He examined it closely, then looked back at her. "It's just an old ornament, Sarah. You're getting worked up over nothing." "No," she said firmly. "That's from the set I threw away. It shouldn't be here." Mike opened his mouth to argue, but before he could speak, the flashlight flickered. And then they heard it. The sound of faint, distant bells, jingling from somewhere deep inside the house. The sound of bells was faint at first, almost delicate, as if they were coming from far away. But within moments they grew louder, closer, and more distinct, each jingle piercing the silence of the house like a needle. Sarah's chest tightened as she clung to Emily, her eyes darting around the darkened room. The flashlight in Mike's hand flickered again, the beam shaking slightly as he turned toward the source of the sound. "Did you hear that?" Sarah whispered, though the answer was obvious. Mike nodded, his jaw clenched. "It's probably just—" "Don't," Sarah interrupted sharply. "Don't tell me it's nothing. You heard it. You know something's wrong." The bells chimed again, this time with an eerie rhythm as though they were marking time. 1, 2, 3. "Where's it coming from?" Emily whimpered, her tiny voice barely audible. Mike raised the flashlight, scanning the room. The beam danced across the walls, the furniture, the broken shards of the snow globe still scattered on the floor. Nothing seemed out of place, until they heard it again. 4, 5, 6. This time the sound wasn't distant. It was inside the room. "Stay here," Mike said firmly, his voice low but commanding. He handed Sarah the flashlight, then picked up the poker she had dropped. "No," Sarah hissed. "Don't go." "I'll be fine," he said, though his expression betrayed his own uncertainty. Sarah wanted to stop him, but the words caught in her throat. She tightened her grip on Emily, holding the flashlight steady as Mike moved toward the hallway. As soon as he stepped out of the room, the bells stopped. The sudden silence was oppressive, heavier than any noise. Sarah's pulse pounded in her ears, and for a moment she thought maybe, just maybe, it was over. And then the laughter started. It was soft at first, barely more than a giggle, but it was unmistakable. A child's laughter, high-pitched and playful, echoed through the house. Emily froze, her wide eyes locking on her mother's. "Mommy?" Sarah's mouth went dry. "It's okay," she said, though she didn't believe it for a second. The laughter grew louder, more distorted, as though it were coming from multiple directions at once. Mike's voice cut through the noise. "Sarah, get in here." The panic in his tone sent a jolt of fear through her. She scooped Emily into her arms and rushed into the hallway, the flashlight beam bouncing erratically as she ran. She found Mike standing at the base of the staircase, his face pale and his eyes fixed on something at the top of the stairs. "What is it?" Sarah demanded, her voice shaking. He didn't answer. He just pointed. Sarah followed his gaze, and her breath caught in her throat. At the top of the stairs stood a figure. It was small, no taller than Emily, and dressed in what looked like tattered Christmas pajamas. Its face was obscured by the shadows, but its head was tilted unnaturally to the side, as though it were examining them. The laughter stopped abruptly, replaced by a deep, guttural growl that didn't belong to any child. And then the figure moved. It didn't walk, it slid as though its feet weren't touching the ground. It descended the stairs slowly, one jerky movement at a time, its head never breaking eye contact with Sarah. "Get back," Mike shouted, raising the poker. The figure stopped halfway down the stairs, its head twitching violently to one side. The growling grew louder, almost deafening, and then the figure opened its mouth. What came out wasn't a scream. It wasn't a word. It was a sound, low, guttural, and so unnatural that it made Sarah's stomach churn. And then, without warning, it vanished. One moment it was there, and the next the stairs were empty. "What the hell was that?" Mike muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah couldn't answer. She was too busy scanning the darkness, her heart racing as she clutched Emily tighter. And then, from somewhere above them, came the sound of heavy footsteps. "Upstairs?" Mike said grimly. "No," Sarah said firmly. "We need to leave. Now. We can't just—" "Yes, we can," she snapped. "We'll come back in the morning. Call the police. But we are not staying here tonight." Mike hesitated, but the fear in Sarah's voice convinced him. He nodded, grabbing her hand and leading them toward the front door. But as they reached the entryway, they stopped dead in their tracks. The door was gone. Where the front door had been just moments ago was now a solid wall, as though it had never existed. Sarah stared in disbelief, her mind struggling to comprehend what she was seeing. "This isn't real," she whispered. "This can't be real." Mike pounded on the wall, his voice rising in panic. "What the hell is this? Where's the door?" Emily began to cry, burying her face in Sarah's chest. "We're trapped," Sarah said, her voice barely audible. "No, we're not," Mike said firmly, though the fear in his eyes betrayed him. "We'll find another way out." He turned and led them toward the kitchen, but the moment they stepped through the doorway, they froze again. The kitchen wasn't the kitchen anymore. It was a completely different room, a dark, windowless space lined with old wooden beams and dripping with water. The floor was covered in what looked like frost, and the air was so cold that Sarah could see her breath. "This isn't possible," she whispered, her voice trembling. The sound of the bells started again, this time louder and more chaotic, as though they were coming from all around them. And then, in the corner of the room, something moved. The walls of the house seemed to pulse with an almost living rhythm, swelling inward and exhaling outward as if the structure itself was breathing. Sarah clung to Emily, her fingers trembling as they gripped her daughter's small, cold hands. Mike was ahead of them, moving with frantic purpose, though every direction they turned only led them further into the house's maze-like corridors. "Mike!" Sarah shouted, her voice cracking. "Where are we going? There's no way out." "We keep moving," he yelled back, not slowing down. "There has to be a door, a window, something." But every corner they turned only revealed more of the same. Endless hallways lined with flickering lights and faded wallpaper that peeled at the edges. The air smelled damp, like soil after heavy rain, but beneath it was something far worse, the faint metallic tang of blood. And then there was the sound. The bells had grown louder, their once melodic chimes now sharp and discordant, accompanied by faint whispers that seemed to come from the walls themselves. The whispers were faint at first, incoherent murmurs that sent shivers down Sarah's spine. But as they continued, the words became clearer. "Sarah, Emily, you shouldn't have come back." Sarah stopped in her tracks, her breath hitching in her throat. "Did you hear that?" Mike turned, his eyes wide. "Keep moving." "No, Mike," she snapped, her fear boiling over into anger. "Something is talking to us." "Mommy," Emily whimpered, her voice barely above a whisper. "Who's saying our names?" Sarah didn't have an answer. She could barely think, her mind clouded by terror. And then, as if responding to Emily's question, the walls shuddered violently, sending flakes of wallpaper raining down around them. "Stay close," Mike said, gripping Sarah's arm. He pushed open the nearest door, revealing what should have been the dining room. Instead, it was something else entirely. The room was vast and empty, its walls made of rough, dark stone. The air inside was freezing, each breath Sarah took burning her lungs like icy needles. The floor was covered in a thin layer of frost, crunching under their feet as they stepped inside. "Where are we?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. Mike didn't answer. He scanned the room, his grip tightening on the poker he still carried. At the center of the room was a single object, A massive, ornate Christmas tree. It was unlike anything Sarah had ever seen, its branches impossibly tall and covered in shimmering red and gold ornaments. But as they approached, she realized the ornaments weren't ornaments at all. They were faces. Tiny, porcelain faces hung from the tree, each one eerily lifelike. Their expressions varied. Some were smiling, others were frozen in terror, but all of them had eyes that seemed to follow Sarah as she moved. "Mike," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "What is this?" Mike shook his head, his face pale. "I don't know. Let's just keep moving." But as they turned to leave, the door slammed shut behind them. The sound echoed through the room like a gunshot, and Sarah spun around, her heart pounding. "It's locked," Mike yelled, yanking on the handle. Sarah backed away from the door, clutching Emily tightly. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for another exit. But there was none. And then one of the faces on the tree began to move. Its tiny porcelain mouth opened and a high-pitched, childlike voice spilled out. "Why did you forget us, Sarah?" Sarah froze, her blood running cold. Mike turned, his eyes narrowing. "Who said that?" Another face moved, its expression shifting from a serene smile to a twisted grimace. "You don't belong here. Stop it." Sarah screamed, her voice cracking. But the voices didn't stop. More and more of the faces came to life, their porcelain features twisting and contorting as they spoke. "Why did you leave us? Why did you forget? Why did you come back?" "I didn't," Sarah shouted, her voice trembling. "I don't even know what you're talking about." The tree began to shake violently, its branches rattling as if caught in a storm. The faces swayed and twisted, their voices growing louder and more chaotic. And then, one by one, the ornaments began to fall. The porcelain faces shattered as they hit the ground, each one releasing a burst of icy air that sent shards flying in every direction. Sarah shielded Emily, ducking as a shard sliced through the air inches from her face. "Mike, do something," she yelled. "I'm trying," he shouted back, slamming the poker against the door. But it was no use, the door wouldn't budge. The room grew colder, the frost on the floor spreading rapidly until it coated their shoes. Sarah's breath came in short, visible puffs, her chest tightening with every inhale. And then the whispers returned. "Run, Sarah. Run, Emily." Sarah looked around wildly, her panic mounting. "Run where?" The tree stopped shaking, its branches falling still. For a moment, the room was silent except for their ragged breathing. And then the floor beneath them cracked. A loud, splintering sound filled the room as the frost-covered floor gave way, the ground beneath them collapsing into darkness. Sarah screamed as she clung to Emily, her stomach lurching as they fell. The descent felt endless, the icy air rushing past them as they plunged deeper and deeper into the void. And then, just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. They hit the ground hard, the impact knocking the wind out of Sarah. She groaned, her body aching as she struggled to sit up. "Emily," she called out, her voice hoarse. "Here, Mommy," Emily replied, her voice shaky but unhurt. Sarah let out a sigh of relief, pulling her daughter close. "Mike." "I'm okay," he said, his voice strained. "But where are we?" Sarah looked around, her heart sinking. They were in a cavernous space, the walls made of the same dark stone as the room above. The only light came from a faint, flickering glow in the distance. "Is that fire?" Mike asked, squinting at the glow. Sarah didn't answer. She didn't want to know what was waiting for them. But as the whispers began again, louder and more insistent than before, she realized they didn't have a choice. They had to move forward. The cavern stretched endlessly before them, the faint flickering glow casting eerie, shifting shadows across the walls. Every sound echoed, amplifying the crunch of their footsteps on the frost-laden ground. Sarah held Emily tightly, her fingers trembling as they moved toward the light. Behind them, the faint jingling of bells continued, growing softer yet somehow more menacing with every step. "Do you think this leads somewhere?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "It has to," Mike replied, though his tone betrayed his doubt. He gripped the poker like a lifeline, his knuckles white. As they walked, the air grew warmer, the frost beneath their feet melting into dark, damp stone. The walls of the cavern glistened as if they were sweating, and the metallic tang in the air grew stronger, almost overpowering. Emily tugged at Sarah's sleeve, her small voice breaking the heavy silence. "Mommy, I don't like it here." "I know, sweetie," Sarah said, trying to keep her voice steady. "We'll get out soon, I promise." But even as she said the words, doubt gnawed at her. The glow ahead grew brighter, and soon they could make out its source, a massive, circular pit in the center of the cavern. Flames licked the edges, their light casting long, jagged shadows across the walls. Around the pit stood 4 tall figures, their forms shrouded in dark, tattered cloaks that seemed to writhe like living things. What is this?" Sarah whispered, pulling Emily closer. Mike didn't answer. His eyes were locked on the figures, his body tense. One of the cloaked figures turned slowly as though sensing their presence. Its face was obscured, but beneath the hood, 2 pinpricks of light glowed faintly, eyes that burned with a cold, unnatural fire. "Welcome," the figure said, its voice deep and resonant, echoing through the cavern like a tolling bell. Sarah froze, her breath caught in her throat. Mike stepped in front of her and Emily, raising the poker defensively. "Who are you?" Mike demanded, his voice steady despite the fear etched across his face. The figure tilted its head, the movement slow and deliberate. "We are the keepers. And you trespassers?" "Keepers of what?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. The figure gestured toward the pit. "Of this place. Of the forgotten. And now of you." The word sent a chill down Sarah's spine. She glanced at Mike, whose grip on the poker tightened. "We didn't mean to come here," Mike said, his voice firm. "We just want to leave." The figures laughed, a low, guttural sound that made Sarah's stomach turn. "Leave?" one of them said, stepping forward. Its voice was softer, almost mocking. "There is no leaving. You belong here now." "No," Sarah said, shaking her head. "That's not true. We don't belong here. You don't remember, do you?" The first figure interrupted, its glowing eyes locking onto hers. "You've forgotten what you did." Sarah blinked, her heart racing. "What I did? I don't know what you're talking about." The figures exchanged glances, their movements unnervingly synchronized. "You will," the second figure said. Before Sarah could respond, the ground beneath them shifted. The pit flared, the flames roaring to life, and the cavern was filled with the sound of screams, countless voices crying out in agony. "Mommy?" Emily screamed, burying her face in Sarah's chest. "Stay back," Mike shouted, stepping closer to the pit. "Don't come near us." But the figures didn't move. Instead, they raised their hands in unison, their long, skeletal fingers pointing toward Sarah. "Remember," they said in a single, chilling voice. And then the cavern dissolved. The world around them twisted and blurred, the stone walls melting away into darkness. Sarah felt herself falling, the sensation disorienting and nauseating. She clutched Emily tightly, her eyes squeezed shut, and when she finally opened them, she gasped. They were standing in a familiar room. It was the living room of Sarah's childhood home. The Christmas tree stood in the corner, its lights blinking softly. The fireplace crackled with warmth, and the scent of pine filled the air. How are we here?" Sarah whispered, her voice shaking. Mike looked around, his brow furrowed. "Is this your house?" "It was," Sarah said. "When I was a kid." "Mommy, who's that?" Emily asked, pointing toward the tree. Sarah turned and froze. A young girl sat on the floor in front of the tree, her back to them. She wore a red dress and had long, dark hair that curled at the ends. In her hands, she held a small, glass ornament, the same one Sarah had seen in the house earlier. That's me," Sarah whispered, her heart pounding. The girl turned, her face pale and expressionless. Her eyes locked onto Sarah's, and for a moment, neither of them moved. And then the girl smiled. "You forgot me," the girl said, her voice soft and haunting. Sarah took a step back, her mind racing. "This isn't real. This can't be real." The girl stood, the ornament still clutched in her hand. "You left us, Sarah. You promised you'd come back, but you never did." "I don't know what you're talking about," Sarah said, her voice rising. The girl's smile faded, replaced by an expression of deep sadness. "You will?" And with that, the room began to change. The walls darkened, the warm glow of the fireplace fading into an icy blue light. The tree's lights flickered and died, and the ornaments fell to the floor one by one, shattering on impact. The girl stepped closer, her movements slow and deliberate. "Do you remember what happened that night, Sarah?" "I don't," Sarah began, but her voice trailed off as memories began to flood back. She saw herself as a child, sitting in front of the tree with her younger sister, Lily. They were laughing, exchanging gifts, the room filled with the warmth and joy of Christmas. But then the memory shifted. The laughter turned to screams. The warmth became suffocating heat. Sarah saw flames consuming the tree, the ornaments bursting like fireworks. She heard Lily's cries, saw her sister's terrified face as the fire spread. And then there was darkness. "No," Sarah whispered, tears streaming down her face. "That's not what happened. It can't be." The girl, her younger self, nodded. "You left me. You left her." "No," Sarah screamed, falling to her knees. "I didn't mean to. I was just a kid." The cavern returned, the figures standing in a circle around her. "You forgot," they said in unison. "But the house remembers." The pit flared again, and Sarah realized with chilling clarity that this wasn't just about her. The house wasn't just haunted. It was waiting for her. The air in the cavern felt heavier now, pressing down on Sarah like a suffocating blanket. She was back on her knees, clutching Emily so tightly the little girl whimpered. Mike knelt beside them, his face pale and drenched in sweat. The figures around the pit stood motionless, their glowing eyes fixed on Sarah. "You've remembered," one of them said, their voice echoing ominously. "But it's not enough." "Enough for what?" Mike barked, his frustration bubbling over. "We don't even know what you want from us." The flames in the pit roared, their glow casting sinister shadows across the walls. One of the figures stepped forward, its skeletal hands extending toward Sarah. "We don't want anything from you," it said, its tone icy and detached. "We only offer what you deserve." Sarah felt her stomach drop. "What do you mean?" The figure tilted its head, the glowing eyes narrowing. "You abandoned her. You left her to burn." "No," Sarah stammered, her voice cracking. I didn't mean to. I was just a child. I couldn't save her." "But you ran," another figure said, stepping closer. "You saved yourself." The words cut deep, striking a wound Sarah thought had long healed. The memories were vivid now, playing out in her mind like a scene from an old, grainy film. The fire, the screams, Lily's tiny hand reaching out for her, and the overwhelming heat that drove her to flee. "I couldn't," Sarah whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I couldn't save her." The figures didn't respond. Instead, they gestured toward the pit. The flames parted, revealing a dark, swirling void at its center. "She's waiting," one of them said. The ground beneath Sarah seemed to shift, pulling her closer to the edge of the pit. She dug her heels into the stone, holding Emily tightly. "Mommy, what's happening?" Emily cried, her small voice trembling with fear. "It's okay, baby," Sarah said, though her voice betrayed her own terror. "I won't let anything happen to you." Mike grabbed Sarah's arm, pulling her back from the edge. "We're not going anywhere near that thing," he said firmly. But the figures raised their hands in unison, and the ground beneath them cracked. "You don't have a choice," they said. Before Sarah could react, the floor crumbled, sending them tumbling into the void. The fall was disorienting, an endless descent through cold, suffocating darkness. Sarah clung to Emily, her screams swallowed by the void. Mike's voice was distant, barely audible over the deafening rush of air. And then, just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. They landed with a jarring thud on cold, hard ground. Sarah groaned, her body aching as she sat up. She looked around, her heart sinking. They were in a forest, but it wasn't like any forest Sarah had ever seen. The trees were tall and gnarled, their twisted branches reaching toward the sky like skeletal hands. The ground was covered in a thick layer of snow, but it wasn't white, it was a sickly shade of gray. "Where are we?" Mike asked, his voice shaky. "I don't know," Sarah replied, pulling Emily close. The forest was silent, eerily so. No wind rustled the branches, no animal stirred in the underbrush. The only sound was the faint jingling of bells, coming from somewhere deep within the trees. "We need to keep moving," Mike said, helping Sarah to her feet. "Which way?" Sarah asked, looking around. Mike pointed toward a narrow path that wound its way through the trees. "That way. It's the only way forward." Reluctantly, Sarah nodded. She held Emily's hand tightly as they began to walk, the crunch of their footsteps the only sound in the oppressive silence. As they walked, the path seemed to stretch endlessly before them. The trees closed in on either side, their branches forming an almost impenetrable canopy above. The faint jingling of bells grew louder, mingling with the sound of faint whispers. "Do you hear that?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mike nodded. "Yeah, it's the same as before." The whispers grew louder, more distinct. Sarah strained to make out the words, her heart pounding in her chest. She's here? She's waiting? Don't look back. The last phrase sent a shiver down Sarah's spine. She tightened her grip on Emily's hand, her eyes fixed on the path ahead. Don't look back, she repeated under her breath, as much to herself as to Emily. But the temptation was overwhelming. The whispers seemed to come from just behind her, their voices familiar and taunting. Sarah? Sarah, it's me? She stopped in her tracks, her breath hitching. Lily? She whispered, turning her head slightly. Don't. Mike snapped, grabbing her arm. Whatever it is, it's not her. Sarah hesitated, her mind racing. The whispers were so familiar, so real. But as much as she wanted to look, something deep inside her told her Mike was right. Keep moving, he said firmly. Sarah nodded, forcing herself to take another step forward. The path eventually led them to a clearing. At its center stood a small, dilapidated cabin, its wooden walls warped and covered in frost. The windows were dark, and the door hung ajar, creaking softly in the still air. This doesn't feel right, Sarah said, her voice trembling. We don't have a choice, Mike replied. There's nowhere else to go. Reluctantly, they approached the cabin. Mike pushed the door open, the hinges groaning in protest. Inside, the air was cold and damp, and the floor was covered in a thin layer of frost. At the center of the room was a table, and on it sat a single object, a snow globe. Sarah's heart sank as she approached the table, her eyes fixed on the globe. Inside was a miniature version of the cabin, surrounded by snow-covered trees. This was mine, she said, her voice barely audible. What do you mean? Mike asked, his brow furrowed. I had one just like this when I was a kid, Sarah replied. Lily and I used to play with it all the time. As she reached out to touch the globe, the whispers returned, louder and more insistent. Sarah, open it. She's waiting. Her hand trembled as she picked up the globe, the cold glass sending a shiver through her. The snow inside began to swirl faster and faster, until the scene inside the globe blurred. And then, with a deafening crack, the globe shattered. The room dissolved around them, and Sarah found herself standing in the living room of her childhood home once again. The Christmas tree was gone, replaced by the charred remains of furniture and walls blackened by smoke. Lily? Sarah called out, her voice echoing in the empty space. From the shadows, a figure emerged. It was a young girl, her face pale and expressionless, her eyes hollow. Why did you leave me? The girl asked, her voice soft and haunting. I didn't mean to, Sarah said, tears streaming down her face. I was scared. I didn't know what to do. The girl stepped closer, her gaze piercing. You promised you'd come back. I'm here now, Sarah said, her voice trembling. The girl tilted her head, her expression unreadable. But it's too late. The floor beneath Sarah began to crack, and the whispers grew louder, their voices a chaotic cacophony. Mommy? Emily screamed, clinging to Sarah. Sarah held her tightly, her mind racing. She didn't know what to do, but she knew one thing. She wouldn't run this time. The air was thick, oppressive, as though the room itself was alive and pressing down on them. The cracking floorboards beneath Sarah's feet seemed to stretch, groaning louder with every second. Emily's cries only heightened the tension, her little hands clutching Sarah's sweater with desperate strength. Sarah forced herself to meet the gaze of the girl, Lily. But this wasn't her Lily. This was something else, something twisted and broken. I'm sorry, Sarah shouted, her voice quaking. I was just a child. I didn't know what to do. The girl's hollow eyes didn't blink, her pale lips curling into something between a grimace and a sneer. And now you'll feel what I felt. Alone. Forgotten. No? Sarah screamed, pulling Emily closer. I won't let that happen again. The girl, Lily, extended her hand, her nails blackened and cracked. The room seemed to tilt as the air grew colder. Mike, standing a few feet away, tried to steady himself, shouting something, but his voice was drowned out by a sound that seemed to rise from the walls themselves, a low, guttural growl. Sarah, get out of there. Mike's voice broke through the noise, but Sarah couldn't move. The figure of Lily stepped closer, the shadows clinging to her like a second skin. But then, in a voice that was barely her own, she whispered, You don't leave until I say so. The room shifted again, and suddenly they weren't in the house anymore. Sarah blinked rapidly, disoriented. They were standing in the middle of a snow-covered field. But this wasn't an ordinary field, it was endless. The snow was so pure it seemed to glow, and the sky above them was an unnatural shade of gray, with no stars or moon in sight. What is this place? Mike asked, his voice barely audible. Sarah scanned the field, her breath visible in the icy air. The silence was deafening. Emily whimpered in her arms, burying her face in Sarah's chest. "We're not alone," Sarah said finally, her voice trembling. From the edge of the field, figures began to emerge. Dozens of them. They were human-shaped but featureless, their forms translucent like mist. They glided toward them silently, their movements eerily smooth. "Stay behind me," Mike said, stepping in front of Sarah and Emily. The figures surrounded them, their presence suffocating. And then, one by one, they began to whisper. "You left her. You forgot her. You deserve this." Sarah clenched her jaw, refusing to give in to the fear that threatened to consume her. "What do you want from me?" she shouted, her voice echoing across the field. The whispers stopped. One figure stepped forward, its misty form solidifying slightly. It raised an arm, pointing to a dark shape in the distance, a tall, twisted tree. "You must go there," it said, its voice hollow and cold. "And if we don't?" Mike challenged, his fists clenched. The figure didn't answer. Instead, the whispers resumed, louder this time, a chaotic cacophony of voices that seemed to drill into their minds. "We don't have a choice," Sarah said, grabbing Mike's arm. "We have to go." Reluctantly, Mike nodded. He led the way with Sarah and Emily close behind. The journey to the tree was agonizingly slow. The snow seemed to cling to their legs, making every step a struggle. The figures didn't follow, but their whispers carried on the wind, haunting them. As they approached the tree, Sarah noticed something strange. Hanging from its gnarled branches were dozens of ornaments, each one glowing faintly. They were Christmas ornaments, but their designs were crude, almost childlike. "What is this?" Sarah asked, her voice barely a whisper. Mike reached out to touch one of the ornaments, but Sarah grabbed his hand. "Don't," she warned. "Why not?" he asked, pulling his hand away. "I don't know," Sarah admitted. It doesn't feel right." Emily tugged on Sarah's sweater, pointing to the base of the tree. "Mommy, look." Sarah followed Emily's gaze and froze. At the base of the tree was a small, tattered doll. It was covered in dirt and frost, but Sarah recognized it immediately. "That's Lily's," she said, her voice shaking. "Are you sure?" Mike asked, his brow furrowed. Sarah nodded, her heart pounding. She never went anywhere without it. As she reached for the doll, the whispers stopped abruptly. The silence was so sudden it felt like a physical weight had been lifted. But then the ground beneath them began to shake. The tree's branches creaked, their movements unnaturally slow and deliberate. The ornaments began to glow brighter, their light casting eerie shadows across the snow. "Get back!" Mike shouted, pulling Sarah and Emily away from the tree. But it was too late. The tree's roots burst from the ground, twisting and writhing like serpents. They shot toward Sarah, wrapping around her legs and pulling her toward the tree. "Mommy?" Emily screamed, reaching for her. "Run!" Sarah shouted, struggling against the roots. But Emily refused to let go. Mike grabbed her, pulling her away as the roots tightened their grip on Sarah. "Mike, take her and go," Sarah shouted, her voice filled with desperation. "I'm not leaving you." Mike yelled back, grabbing one of the roots and trying to pry it off her. The tree groaned, its branches reaching toward the sky. The ornaments shattered one by one, releasing bursts of light that blinded them. And then, from the trunk of the tree, a face began to emerge. It was Lily. But it wasn't the Lily Sarah remembered. This face was twisted, her features contorted with anger and pain. Her hollow eyes burned with a hatred that made Sarah's blood run cold. "You left me," the face said, its voice echoing through the field. "No," Sarah whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I'm here now. I'm here to make it right." The face sneered. "It's too late." The roots tightened around Sarah, pulling her closer to the tree. She could feel the bark against her skin, cold and unyielding. "Mommy?" Emily screamed, tears streaming down her face. Sarah looked at her daughter, her heart breaking. "Emily, listen to me," she said, her voice trembling. "You have to be brave. No matter what happens, you have to keep going." "No," Emily cried, struggling against Mike's grip. "I won't leave you." "Emily," Sarah shouted, her voice filled with both fear and love. "You have to." Before Emily could respond, the tree's roots wrapped around Sarah's arms, pulling her into the trunk. "Sarah," Mike shouted, his voice filled with anguish. And then everything went black. The cold was unbearable. It cut through Sarah's clothes, chilling her bones to the core. She blinked, trying to make sense of the darkness around her, but it was as if the world itself had ceased to exist. The silence was oppressive, suffocating. Her chest tightened with every breath, and yet there was no air. "Emily," she whispered hoarsely, her voice sounding foreign to her ears. But there was no answer. Sarah tried to move, but her body felt like it was trapped in thick, sticky mud. She couldn't feel the ground beneath her, nor could she see anything, but she could feel a presence. Something just out of reach, watching her. Waiting. Her heart hammered in her chest. The air seemed to thicken, and she could hear faint whispers again. Soft at first, almost inaudible, but slowly growing louder. "You shouldn't have come back." Sarah froze. The voice was familiar, but she couldn't place it. It wasn't the voice of Emily nor Mike. It was something else. Something darker. "You abandoned her." Sarah's stomach dropped. She remembered Lily. The girl who had once been her best friend, her closest companion. The girl whose innocence had been taken away, whose trust had been shattered. The girl who had died alone, forgotten, and forsaken. But now Lily was here. And Sarah knew with a sudden and terrible certainty that she would never escape until Lily's story was finished. "Lily?" Sarah called into the darkness, her voice trembling. "I never meant to hurt you. I was just a child. I didn't know what I was doing." A low laugh echoed from the shadows, sending chills down Sarah's spine. "You still don't understand, do you?" The voice was colder now, filled with a malice that made Sarah's blood run cold. "I didn't know what happened to you. I didn't." "You never wanted to know," the voice interrupted, now right behind her, almost a whisper in her ear. Sarah's pulse quickened as she felt something cold brush against her neck. It was like ice, leaving a trail of frost in its wake. She spun around, but there was nothing there, only the crushing darkness. She opened her mouth to call for Emily, but no sound came out. "Do you feel it?" the voice whispered again, this time from all directions. "Do you feel the guilt? The weight of it pressing on you, suffocating you?" "I'm sorry," Sarah said, the words spilling from her mouth in desperation. "Please just let me go. Let me make it right." There was a long pause. The whispers stopped. The air became still. For a fleeting moment, Sarah thought she had made it through, that maybe the darkness would let her go. But then something shifted. The temperature dropped even further, if that was even possible. The darkness pressed in tighter, almost as if it were trying to crush her, to consume her whole. And then, through the suffocating silence, came a sound, a loud crack, followed by a low growl that vibrated through Sarah's very bones. She could hear something heavy moving toward her, and she wasn't alone anymore. From the corner of her eye, she saw movement. A figure, black and shadowy, with long clawed hands scraping across the ground as it moved. She couldn't make out its face, but its presence was overwhelming. The air seemed to warp around it, distorting reality itself. And then, it spoke in a voice that was not human. "You thought you could leave me behind, but you will never escape." The figure lunged at her with terrifying speed, its claws reaching for her. Sarah gasped, instinctively throwing herself to the side, but the shadow was faster than she could react. It grabbed her arm, its icy grip sending shockwaves through her body. "You will never escape," it repeated, dragging her deeper into the abyss. Sarah struggled, kicking and thrashing, but it was useless. Her body was frozen, weighed down by an invisible force. The creature's grip tightened, dragging her closer to the center of the darkness, where she could sense something far worse. Something older, something far more powerful, waiting for her. And then, as if the universe had decided to show mercy, there was a sudden flash of light. A blinding, searing light that pierced through the suffocating blackness, forcing the shadow to recoil. The creature hissed, its form beginning to evaporate like mist in the wind. Sarah gasped for air, her heart racing as the light enveloped her. But the light didn't last. In an instant, everything was gone and she was back in the field. The field from before. But this time it was different. The snow was no longer pure and untouched. It was stained red, as though the very earth was bleeding. The sky above them had darkened even further, and the temperature was unbearable. The wind howled around her, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of death. Sarah gasped, looking around in a panic. "Mike," she screamed. "Emily." But there was no answer. The field was empty and she was alone. Suddenly, from behind her, she heard the faintest sound, a soft, haunting giggle. Sarah spun around, her heart hammering in her chest, and there she was, Lily. The twisted, monstrous version of Lily, standing just a few feet away, her pale face a mask of rage and sorrow. "You couldn't save her," Lily said, her voice a cold whisper. "You never could. You should have known. You should have stayed away." "I tried," Sarah shouted, her voice cracking. "I didn't know. I never wanted any of this to happen." The wind picked up, howling louder as Lily took a step closer. Her eyes glowed with an unnatural light, her lips twisted into a cruel smile. "Too late now," she said, her voice a low hiss. "You'll never be free." Sarah stepped back, her breath coming in sharp gasps. "What do you want from me?" she cried. Lily's eyes narrowed. "You know what I want. You've always known." And then, without another word, Lily lunged at her. The force of Lily's lunge knocked Sarah to the ground, the wind knocked out of her lungs. She gasped, trying to scramble to her feet, but the air seemed to have thickened, dragging her down with each movement. Her hands shook as she pushed against the snow, trying to find purchase, but the ground beneath her was cold, unyielding. Lily's laugh echoed around her, a high-pitched sound that reverberated through the dark field like nails scraping against glass. Sarah could feel her presence before she even turned her head, the coldness of it sweeping over her like a storm. "You can't run anymore, Sarah," Lily's voice whispered, but it was not the soft, innocent tone Sarah remembered. It was twisted, laden with malice, and so cold it made Sarah's skin crawl. "There's no way out." Desperately, Sarah scrambled to her feet, her heart pounding in her chest. The field stretched on endlessly in every direction, but no matter where she looked, all she saw was the same haunting darkness, the same snow tainted by red. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. The pressure on her chest was suffocating. "Emily, Mike," she whispered, her voice trembling. But the silence that followed was deafening. Lily's shadow stretched across the ground, and her form seemed to grow, her arms reaching toward Sarah with a sickening, unnatural fluidity. As the shadow of her figure grew larger, Sarah's body tensed in fear. This wasn't just a child. This was something far worse. Sarah's eyes darted around frantically. The twisted tree was still there, standing in the distance like a monument to pain. But there was something else now, an old house, weathered and broken, standing just behind it. The windows were dark, empty, but she felt it in her bones. She felt like whatever haunted this place was inside that house. And just like before, Sarah couldn't escape. Lily's figure was now closer. Her hollow eyes locked onto Sarah's, and her lips curled into a menacing smile. "You left me," she whispered, her voice sweet and dangerous all at once. "But you can never leave this place. You belong here now." Sarah froze, panic flooding through her. "I didn't leave you. I was just a child. I didn't know what happened." But Lily's eyes narrowed, and with a chilling hiss, she began to step forward, the ground shaking with each movement. "You knew enough. You knew you should have saved me. You knew you should have stayed." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. The guilt, the crushing weight of it, pulled at her, squeezing her chest. But she knew she couldn't let it consume her. She couldn't let Lily's twisted version of her memories destroy her. Not again. Without thinking, Sarah turned toward the old house, her body moving on instinct. She didn't know why, but something deep inside her told her that the answers she was looking for, maybe even the way out, were inside that house. The image of the house seemed to pull her toward it, as if it had a gravitational force of its own. She stumbled through the snow, feeling it catch at her boots, each step like wading through molasses. Behind her, Lily's laughter followed, echoing through the night air. "Running won't help you, Sarah. You can't escape this." But Sarah didn't look back. She didn't have time to listen to the voice, to feel the weight of her past bearing down on her. She had to move forward. She had to get to the house. As she reached the steps, the door creaked open by itself, the wood groaning as if it had been untouched for years. Sarah hesitated, her heart pounding in her chest, but the cold wind behind her, the sound of Lily's pursuit, pushed her forward. She stepped into the darkness. Inside, the house was eerily quiet. The air smelled stale, old, as though it had been abandoned long ago. The floor beneath her feet was covered in a thick layer of dust, and the furniture was shrouded in white sheets, like ghosts from another time. The walls were lined with portraits of people Sarah didn't recognize. Some of the faces had been scratched out, their eyes blacked out with ink as if someone, or something, had tried to erase their memories. She felt eyes on her, eyes that weren't there. A sudden chill washed over her, as if the house itself were watching, waiting. But Sarah pushed the thought aside and moved further inside, her every step feeling heavier than the last. The house seemed to close in around her, the shadows growing deeper, the air thicker. There was a door at the end of the hallway, slightly ajar, a faint light seeping through the crack. It beckoned her. She had to go through. She had no other choice. As Sarah approached the door, she could hear something, voices. Soft, faint whispers coming from within the room. She couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. It was as if someone was pleading, begging for help, but the sound was distorted, muffled like a distant echo. Taking a deep breath, she pushed the door open. Inside, the room was dimly lit by a single flickering candle. It cast long shadows across the walls, making the room feel even smaller, more claustrophobic. But that wasn't what caught Sarah's attention. At the center of the room stood a small wooden table, covered in what appeared to be old photographs, torn and faded. And in the center of the table, something that made Sarah's blood run cold, a doll. It was a doll, but it wasn't just any doll. It was the same one Sarah had seen earlier, the one that had been left under the twisted tree. It was tattered, its face scratched out, its limbs bent at unnatural angles. It was the very doll that had haunted her memories for so long. Her breath caught in her throat as she reached for it. But as soon as her fingers touched the doll, the temperature in the room plummeted. The walls seemed to stretch, bending around her as if the house itself was alive, trying to swallow her whole. And then, from behind her, came the voice. "You never should have come back." Sarah spun around, her heart racing. But no one was there. The force of Lily's lunge knocked Sarah to the ground, the wind knocked out of her lungs. She gasped, trying to scramble to her feet, but the air seemed to have thickened, dragging her down with each movement. Her hands shook as she pushed against the snow, trying to find purchase, but the ground beneath her was cold, unyielding. Lily's laugh echoed around her, a high-pitched sound that reverberated through the dark field like nails scraping against glass. Sarah could feel her presence before she even turned her head, the coldness of it sweeping over her like a storm. "You can't run anymore, Sarah," Lily's voice whispered, but it was not the soft, innocent tone Sarah remembered. It was twisted, laden with malice, and so cold it made Sarah's skin crawl. "There's no way out." Desperately, Sarah scrambled to her feet, her heart pounding in her chest. The field stretched on endlessly in every direction, but no matter where she looked, all she saw was the same haunting darkness, the same snow tainted by red. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. The pressure on her chest was suffocating. "Emily? Mike," she whispered, her voice trembling. But the silence that followed was deafening. Lily's shadow stretched across the ground, and her form seemed to grow, her arms reaching toward Sarah with a sickening, unnatural fluidity. As the shadow of her figure grew larger, Sarah's body tensed in fear. This wasn't just a child. This was something far worse. Sarah's eyes darted around frantically. The twisted tree was still there, standing in the distance like a monument to pain. But there was something else now, an old house, weathered and broken, standing just behind it. The windows were dark, empty, but she felt it in her bones. She felt like whatever haunted this place was inside that house. And just like before, Sarah couldn't escape. Lily's figure was now closer. Her hollow eyes locked onto Sarah's, and her lips curled into a menacing smile. "You left me," she whispered, her voice sweet and dangerous all at once. "But you can never leave this place. You belong here now." Sarah froze, panic flooding through her. "I didn't leave you. I was just a child. I didn't know what happened." But Lily's eyes narrowed, and with a chilling hiss, she began to step forward, the ground shaking with each movement. "You knew enough. You knew you should have saved me. You knew you should have stayed." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. The guilt, the crushing weight of it, pulled at her, squeezing her chest. But she knew she couldn't let it consume her. She couldn't let Lily's twisted version of her memories destroy her. Not again. Without thinking, Sarah turned toward the old house, her body moving on instinct. She didn't know why, but something deep inside her told her that the answers she was looking for, maybe even the way out, were inside that house. The image of the house seemed to pull her toward it, as if it had a gravitational force of its own. She stumbled through the snow, feeling it catch at her boots, each step like wading through molasses. Behind her, Lily's laughter followed, echoing through the night air. "Running won't help you, Sarah. You can't escape this. But Sarah didn't look back. She didn't have time to listen to the voice, to feel the weight of her past bearing down on her. She had to move forward. She had to get to the house. As she reached the steps, the door creaked open by itself, the wood groaning as if it had been untouched for years. Sarah hesitated, her heart pounding in her chest, but the cold wind behind her, the sound of Lily's pursuit, pushed her forward. She stepped into the darkness. Inside, the house was eerily quiet. The air smelled stale, old, as though it had been abandoned long ago. The floor beneath her feet was covered in a thick layer of dust, and the furniture was shrouded in white sheets, like ghosts from another time. The walls were lined with portraits of people Sarah didn't recognize. Some of the faces had been scratched out, their eyes blacked out with ink as if someone, or something, had tried to erase their memories. She felt eyes on her, eyes that weren't there. A sudden chill washed over her, as if the house itself were watching, waiting. But Sarah pushed the thought aside and moved further inside, her every step feeling heavier than the last. The house seemed to close in around her, the shadows growing deeper, the air thicker. There was a door at the end of the hallway, slightly ajar, a faint light seeping through the crack. It beckoned her. She had to go through. She had no other choice. As Sarah approached the door, she could hear something, voices. Soft, faint whispers coming from within the room. She couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. It was as if someone was pleading, begging for help, but the sound was distorted, muffled, like a distant echo. Taking a deep breath, she pushed the door open. Inside, the room was dimly lit by a single flickering candle. It cast long shadows across the walls, making the room feel even smaller, more claustrophobic. But that wasn't what caught Sarah's attention. At the center of the room stood a small wooden table, covered in what appeared to be old photographs, torn and faded. And in the center of the table, something that made Sarah's blood run cold, a doll. It was a doll, but it wasn't just any doll. It was the same one Sarah had seen earlier, the one that had been left under the twisted tree. It was tattered, its face scratched out, its limbs bent at unnatural angles. It was the very doll that had haunted her memories for so long. Her breath caught in her throat as she reached for it. But as soon as her fingers touched the doll, the temperature in the room plummeted. The walls seemed to stretch, bending around her as if the house itself was alive, trying to swallow her whole. And then, from behind her, came the voice. "You never should have come back." Sarah spun around, her heart racing. But no one was there. The voice echoed through the room, bouncing off the walls and reverberating in Sarah's skull. It was familiar. It was almost like the whisper of the wind, but deeper, colder, filled with an emotion Sarah couldn't place. Fear? Rage? Sorrow? Who's there? Sarah asked, her voice trembling, but it wasn't just the cold she could feel anymore. It was the weight of something ancient and heavy, pressing down on her chest, filling her lungs with dread. The shadows in the room seemed to shift as if the darkness itself were alive, creeping around her like tendrils of smoke, twisting and winding. The flickering candlelight cast a harsh, erratic glow on the walls, distorting the faces in the paintings even more. They weren't just people anymore. They were twisted versions of the people Sarah had known. Their eyes were wide with terror, their mouths open in silent screams, and their hands outstretched toward her, as though begging for release. "You shouldn't have touched it," the voice whispered again, low and guttural. "Now you'll never leave." The doll on the table seemed to stare at her with its dark, hollow eyes. It was as though it was the source of the voice, a conduit for whatever malevolent force was trapped in this house. Sarah took a step back, her eyes wide with fear. Her hands trembled at her sides, and the room felt as if it were closing in on her, suffocating her. A sudden, sharp pain shot through her chest, and she gasped, clutching at her heart. It felt as though something inside her was being torn apart. But when she looked down, there was nothing there, no wound, no blood. Just an overwhelming sense of wrongness, of being watched by 1,000 unseen eyes. "Who's doing this to me?" she demanded, though her voice cracked. She didn't know if she was speaking to the house, to Lily's ghost, or something worse. She was completely surrounded by the oppressive darkness, and the oppressive feeling of being trapped. For a moment there was silence. The room was still. The candlelight flickered in the corner of her eye, casting odd shadows across the wooden floorboards. Sarah didn't dare take her eyes off the doll on the table, the source of all her torment. It sat there, untouched, waiting. Then, as if in response to her question, the air grew colder, so cold that she could see her breath, puffing out in white clouds. A sudden chill ran down her spine and she spun around, expecting to see Lily's twisted figure behind her. But instead the room was empty. The shadows had grown darker, deeper, as though the darkness itself was swallowing up the light. A shadow moved. A figure, almost human but distorted, appeared in the corner of the room. It was tall, thin, and impossibly gaunt, with arms that stretched too long. It was draped in shadows, but Sarah could see the sharp, jagged outline of its face, a hollow mask of terror. Its eyes gleamed with hunger. No, not hunger. It was something far worse. It was the look of something that had been waiting for a long time. "You've seen too much, Sarah," it rasped, its voice a mixture of static and broken whispers. "You think you can undo the past? You think you can run from the things you've done?" Sarah's blood ran cold as the creature's long fingers twitched, its shadow creeping along the floor toward her. "No, you can't escape this. You can never escape what's coming." Sarah stumbled backward, her feet tangling in the dust. She had to get out of here. She had to get away from this creature, from whatever it was, but the door behind her slammed shut with a deafening crack, trapping her inside. The thing stepped closer, its thin limbs moving unnaturally fast, closing the gap between them with terrifying speed. "It's already too late for you," it whispered, a low hiss escaping its lips. "You'll never leave this place. You'll never be free. Leave me alone." Sarah screamed, her voice raw with fear, but the creature didn't stop. It just kept coming, its eyes gleaming with malicious intent, its mouth curling into a twisted grin. And then, in that moment, Sarah knew what she had to do. She couldn't run. There was no escaping the house, the darkness, the creature. She had to face whatever this was head on. She had to confront the thing that had been tormenting her for so long, the thing that had been haunting her nightmares. Her hands shook, but she reached out for the doll on the table, her fingers trembling as she touched its cold, lifeless surface. The moment her hand made contact, the world around her seemed to shift. The floor beneath her feet seemed to tremble, and the air grew thick with tension. The whispers grew louder, a chorus of voices calling out in anger, in pain. Sarah's chest tightened with fear as she clutched the doll in her hands, the weight of it pulling her down like an anchor. "You can't change anything," the creature hissed, just a few inches from her now. "You'll never escape. You'll never be free." But Sarah, with all the strength she could muster, lifted the doll and smashed it against the table. The sound of the shattering porcelain was deafening, and in that moment, everything seemed to freeze. The creature screamed, a horrible guttural sound that reverberated through the house. The walls seemed to crack, the ceiling groaning as if the entire house was about to collapse. But Sarah didn't move. She didn't run. She stood there, holding the broken remnants of the doll in her hands. The shadow creature screeched, a final, terrifying wail before it vanished into the darkness, leaving only the echoes of its rage behind. Sarah stood in the silence, trembling but alive. The room was different now. The weight of the darkness had lifted. The oppressive atmosphere was gone, and for the first time since entering the house, Sarah felt the air clear. But it wasn't over. She knew it wasn't over. Not yet. The silence that followed was thick and suffocating. Sarah stood alone in the dark room, the remnants of the doll shattered at her feet, the pieces glistening like forgotten bones. The walls around her were still, their oppressive weight lifting, but she knew better than to believe that the terror had passed. It never truly left. Not here. Not in this cursed place. Sarah wiped her damp palms on her jeans, trying to steady her breath. The air had turned icy once again, but now it was different. It wasn't the cold of a winter's night. It wasn't the typical chill of a haunted house. This was something deeper, more intimate, as though the cold was seeping into her very soul. She glanced around, her heart pounding in her chest. The room had shifted. What had once felt like a claustrophobic prison now seemed almost empty. The oppressive darkness that had hung like a weight had faded into a strange, almost peaceful quiet. But there were no answers here. No comfort. Only the same question that had followed her from the very beginning. What was this place? She stepped forward, her legs unsteady beneath her as if the ground might shift again at any moment. Her mind raced with images of the twisted creature, the shadow that had appeared out of nowhere, its chilling presence now haunting her every thought. It hadn't been a figment of her imagination. It hadn't been a hallucination or a trick of the mind. It had been real, whatever it was. It had come for her, and it had almost claimed her. But it hadn't. Not yet. And it wasn't done. A soft whisper broke the silence, a voice so faint that Sarah almost missed it. "Leave now," it whispered, "before it's too late." She froze, her breath catching in her throat. The voice was familiar, but it wasn't Lily's. It wasn't the same voice that had tormented her before, the one she had tried to outrun for so long. No, this voice was softer, more desperate. "Who's there?" Sarah called, her voice trembling. But there was no answer. Only the cold, empty room staring back at her. "Please, you need to go," the voice urged again, this time more urgent, more frantic. "It's not safe. He's coming." Sarah's pulse quickened. She didn't know who or what this voice belonged to, but she could feel it, the weight of it pressing down on her chest. The darkness in the room felt heavier again, and the temperature dropped so sharply that she could see her breath clouding in front of her face. "Who's coming?" she demanded, her voice cracking as she turned in a circle, searching for the source of the whisper. No response. She wanted to scream, to demand answers, but instead, the word that echoed in her mind was the same one that had been haunting her since she stepped into this cursed house. Escape. Could she? Could she really escape? She shook her head, forcing herself to move forward. She had come this far. There was no turning back now. Not after everything that had happened. She had to find out the truth. She had to uncover what had happened here, what had happened to Lily, to the others. With trembling hands, Sarah reached for the door, pulling it open cautiously. The hallway outside was dark, but the light from the flickering candle inside the room gave just enough illumination for her to see. The shadows seemed to stretch and bend along the walls, curling like fingers reaching toward her. She didn't look at them. She couldn't. She just needed to move. The hallway stretched out before her, long and narrow, lined with old doors that creaked in the wind. The whispers grew louder as she moved, but now they weren't the frantic pleas she had heard before. They were something else. Something colder. Something darker. "You can't run," they said, their voices low and guttural. "You can't escape." Sarah gritted her teeth. She wasn't afraid of voices. She wasn't afraid of the dark. Not anymore. Not after everything she had already faced. But the deeper she walked into the house, the more the walls seemed to close in around her. The doors she passed seemed to stare at her with hollow, unblinking eyes, and she couldn't shake the feeling that there was something behind them, waiting for her to open them. Waiting to take her. And then, as she reached the end of the hallway, she found it. The door. The one that stood apart from the rest. It was different, old, with cracked wood and a tarnished brass knob, as if it hadn't been touched in decades. But Sarah felt it. She felt its pull. It was calling to her. She didn't know how or why, but she couldn't deny it. She reached for the handle, and the instant her fingers brushed it, a violent force tugged at her, pulling her toward the door as though the house itself was alive and yearning for her to enter. The knob turned easily, but there was no creak of the hinges as she pushed it open. The door opened to an entirely different world. On the other side was not a room, not a hallway, but a vast open space. It was a field, blanketed in snow, but it wasn't the same field that Sarah had wandered through earlier. No, this one was different. The snow was pristine, untouched, and the air had a stillness to it that made Sarah feel like she was suspended in time. There were no trees, no sounds, just an overwhelming quiet that made her ears ring. But the strangest thing about this place wasn't the emptiness, it was the sky. Above her, the sky was a deep, dark purple, swirling with black clouds that seemed to move with an unnatural speed. The stars twinkled in strange constellations, and the moon, bright and full, hung unnaturally low in the sky. It was as if the world itself had been turned upside down. And there, in the center of the field, stood a figure. It was small, barely more than a silhouette against the vast expanse of snow. But Sarah knew who it was. She knew without a doubt. Lily. Her heart thudded in her chest, and she took a tentative step forward, the crunch of snow beneath her boots the only sound in the stillness. As she approached, the figure turned to face her, and Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Lily's face was pale, her hair tangled and wild, her eyes hollow and black. But it wasn't just Lily. No, something was wrong. Something had changed. "You shouldn't have come back, Sarah." Lily's voice was barely a whisper, but it was enough to cut through the stillness like a blade. Sarah stood frozen, unsure of what to do next. She was standing face to face with the very thing that had haunted her nightmares. The very thing that had tormented her from the moment she'd entered this cursed place. But what Lily had become wasn't just a ghost. It was something far worse. "Leave," Lily said again, her voice barely audible, a desperate plea hidden beneath the layers of malice. Before he comes? The air around Sarah seemed to freeze as Lily's voice echoed through the empty field. It was a warning, but it felt like more than that. A final plea, desperate and filled with something darker than fear. Something that Sarah couldn't quite place. Lily's figure shifted in the snow, her face unreadable. The once familiar warmth that had radiated from her had vanished. Now there was only the icy grip of something malevolent, something ancient that had taken root in her soul. "Lily," Sarah whispered, taking a cautious step forward, but her feet seemed to sink deeper into the snow. It wasn't snow anymore, she realized. It was something else. Frozen ground, thick and hard, almost as though the earth itself was resisting her every movement. Lily didn't move, but her eyes seemed to follow Sarah, locked in an eternal stare. "You don't understand, Sarah," Lily's voice cracked, and for a brief moment, it sounded like the girl Sarah had known. The girl she had tried to save. "You can't save me. You can't save anyone." The words sent a chill down Sarah's spine, and she stumbled, catching herself before she fell into the deepening snow. Her breath came in short, ragged gasps, and her heart thundered in her chest. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice shaking with both fear and confusion. "What happened to you?" Lily's mouth twitched into a twisted smile, but it wasn't a smile of happiness, it was a grimace of pain. Her eyes locked with Sarah's, and for the briefest moment, Sarah could see something, a glimmer of the person she had once known before the darkness took over. "It wasn't just the house, Sarah," Lily said softly, her voice barely audible against the howling wind that had begun to rise around them. "It was him. He found me. He found us all." Sarah's blood ran cold at the mention of the mysterious Kim. She hadn't heard the name before, but the way Lily spoke, it was as if she feared him more than anything else. More than death, more than the shadows. Whoever he was the one pulling the strings. The one who had trapped them all in this nightmare. "You have to leave," Lily repeated, her voice frantic now, cracking with an urgency that sent terror racing through Sarah's veins. "You can't stay. If you do, you'll be just like me, trapped. Trapped here forever." Sarah shook her head, her pulse pounding in her ears. "No, I'm not leaving. I'm not going to let him win. I have to stop this. I have to find a way to set you free." Lily's eyes darkened, her expression twisting into something almost unrecognizable. "You don't understand," she spat, her voice harsh. "It's too late. You can't change anything now. You're already part of it." The wind picked up again, howling around them, carrying with it the scent of cold earth and decay. The once beautiful field seemed to distort, the snow turning black and slushy, the landscape warping as though the very fabric of reality was being unraveled. The sky darkened further, the purple clouds twisting into ominous shapes, swirling like a storm. Sarah stumbled back, her heart racing. She was no longer standing in the field. She was standing on the edge of a vast, black chasm. The ground beneath her feet cracked open, revealing a yawning abyss below, filled with swirling shadows and the distant sounds of whispered voices. The creature that had tormented her in the house, the one with the hollow, gaping eyes, was now standing in the center of the chasm. Its gaunt form reached toward Sarah, its long, skeletal fingers stretching impossibly far. "No," Sarah gasped, stumbling backward. "This can't be real. This isn't real." But Lily's voice cut through the chaos, as calm and clear as before. "It's real, Sarah. This is what he's done. This is what he does to everyone. To all of us." Sarah's legs shook and she dropped to her knees, her hands gripping the edge of the chasm for support. The darkness was closing in on her, consuming her like the very shadows that had plagued her from the start. There was no escape, no way out. But Lily's gaze softened for a moment and a small, sad smile flickered across her face. "I didn't want this, Sarah," she whispered. "I didn't want you to be here. But now that you are, you can't leave. No one does." With those words, the chasm seemed to widen, and Sarah felt herself being pulled toward it, as though the very earth beneath her was trying to suck her into its depths. Her fingers scraped at the edge of the crack, desperately trying to hold on. She had to fight. She couldn't give in. She couldn't let it take her. But the force pulling her was too strong, and the shadows were closing in, crawling up her legs, her arms, consuming her slowly. She could feel it. The darkness. The endless void pulling her into its cold embrace. "You're mine now," the creature's voice whispered, close enough to touch her ear. Its breath was cold, foul, and its hands reached out to claim her. No? Sarah screamed, her voice raw with terror. She struggled against the grip of the shadows, but it was useless. There was no escaping this. No escaping him. And then, just as she thought she might disappear into the endless darkness, she felt a pull, an unexpected force, yanking her back from the edge. The shadows screamed in fury, but she was no longer alone. Lily's voice was gone. The creature's form dissipated into the wind, vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. The air around her cleared, the chasm sealed shut, and the field returned to its eerie stillness. But Sarah knew. She knew it wasn't over. This was only a taste of what was to come. The nightmare was far from finished. The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah's heart thundered in her chest, each beat echoing in the still air like a warning. Her body trembled, but she couldn't stop herself from moving forward. She had to. She had to keep going, even if she wasn't sure where she was headed anymore. She wiped the cold sweat from her brow and forced herself to focus. The shadows were gone, the chasm closed, but the darkness, the real darkness, still lingered. It was a presence that couldn't be ignored, no matter how hard she tried. It surrounded her, pressing down on her, suffocating her. She was no longer standing in the field, but in a new place, one that felt even more wrong than the last. The landscape had shifted once again, and now she was walking through an old, crumbling town. The buildings were dilapidated, their windows shattered, the doors hanging off their hinges as though they hadn't been touched in years. The streets were cracked, overgrown with weeds and vines that seemed to grow at an unnatural pace. The town felt abandoned, dead. But Sarah knew better. She knew this place. She had seen it before. In dreams. In flashes of memories that didn't quite make sense. The feeling that something had happened here, something terrible, was overwhelming. She took a hesitant step forward, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end, and the familiar sense of dread that had accompanied her from the very beginning tightened its grip on her chest. The streets were eerily quiet. Not a sound could be heard. No birds, no wind, no distant voices. Just silence. But then there was a sound, a faint, rhythmic tapping like footsteps echoing down the cracked, empty street. The sound was faint at first, but it grew louder with each passing second, until it was all she could hear. She turned, her eyes scanning the shadows that stretched out from the ruined buildings, but she saw nothing. Still, the tapping grew louder and it was coming closer. "Hello?" Sarah called out, her voice wavering. The footsteps paused. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity, and Sarah's pulse quickened. She took another step forward, her eyes darting back and forth, but still no one appeared. Then, just as she was about to turn and leave, a figure stepped out of the shadows. It was a man. Tall, with a long coat that billowed around his legs as he walked. His face was hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat, casting a shadow over his features. But even though she couldn't see his face, Sarah could feel the weight of his gaze as though his eyes were watching her, judging her. "Who are you?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. The man didn't answer. Instead, he took another step forward, his boots tapping against the cracked pavement with each movement. The sound was unnerving, almost too perfect, too rhythmic. It was as though he had been walking this same path for years, never deviating, never straying from his course. Sarah took a step back, her instincts telling her to run, to get away from this strange figure, but something held her in place. Something kept her rooted to the ground. "You shouldn't be here," the man's voice was low, almost mechanical, as if he had no emotion behind his words. "None of you should." "Who are you?" Sarah repeated, her voice a little stronger this time. The man stopped just a few feet away from her, his body still, but there was a strange energy in the air now, a tension that made it hard to breathe. Sarah could feel his presence like a weight pressing down on her. "My name is not important," the man said, his voice cold and detached. "What matters is that you are here. And that means you have already chosen." "Chosen?" Sarah repeated, confused. "Chosen for what?" But the man didn't answer. Instead, he lifted one gloved hand, pointing toward the horizon, where the town seemed to stretch on endlessly. It was hard to tell where the town ended and the shadows began, as if the two were merging together, becoming one. "There's no going back now," the man said, his voice colder than the wind that whipped through the empty streets. "You cannot undo what has already been done." Sarah felt her stomach twist into knots. "What are you talking about? What happened here?" The man turned away, his long coat swirling around him as he began to walk in the direction he had pointed. Each step he took echoed through the empty streets, a haunting reminder of the isolation surrounding them. "Follow me," he called over his shoulder. "If you want to understand. If you want to know what's really happening." Sarah hesitated for a moment, but something inside her urged her to follow. Something told her that this was the only way to uncover the truth. With a deep breath, Sarah took a step forward, her heart pounding in her chest as she followed the man into the heart of the abandoned town. The further she walked, the more the silence pressed down on her, suffocating her. As they walked, the town seemed to change. The buildings grew taller, more oppressive, as if they were closing in on her from all sides. The windows seemed to watch her, their shattered glass reflecting her every movement. The air grew colder, and the feeling of dread intensified with each step. Finally, they reached a large, crumbling building at the center of the town. The door was ajar, creaking softly in the wind. The man paused in front of the door, turning to face Sarah. "Inside," he said simply, his voice no longer mechanical, but almost pleading. "You need to see it. You need to understand." Sarah swallowed hard, but she knew she had no choice. She had come this far. There was no turning back now. Taking a deep breath, she stepped through the door. The inside of the building was dark, the air heavy with dust and the scent of decay. The walls were lined with old, cracked paintings and shelves filled with forgotten relics, but it wasn't the furnishings that caught her attention. It was the room itself. The floor was covered in strange symbols, drawn in what looked like blood. They were scattered across the room, their jagged lines and curves forming a complex pattern that seemed to pulse with an energy Sarah couldn't quite understand. As she stepped further into the room, she felt a chill crawl up her spine. Something was here. Something had been here for a long time, and it was waiting. The man stepped past her, moving to the center of the room where a large, stone pedestal stood. Atop it rested a single, ornate box. It looked ancient, its surface covered in layers of dust and grime, but there was something about it that seemed alive. The energy in the room intensified as he reached for it, his hands trembling slightly. "This is where it all began," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "This box, it holds the answers, but it also holds the key to everything." He reached down to open the box, but before he could touch it, a loud, violent sound erupted from the shadows, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps approaching, familiar, rhythmic, and growing louder with each passing second. The man's eyes widened, and Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She knew what was coming, and she was not ready. Sarah's fingers trembled as they hovered over the ornate box. The shadows surrounding her seemed to pulse with an almost unbearable intensity, the air thick and heavy with the weight of unseen eyes. Every breath she took felt like it was being suffocated by the darkness closing in on her. But there was no turning back now. This was the moment. She reached out and touched the box. The moment her fingers made contact, the ground beneath her feet seemed to shift. The walls around her groaned as if the building itself was alive, reacting to her touch. A low hum filled the air, vibrating in her chest, the same hum that had echoed through her mind ever since she had first entered this cursed town. Sarah hesitated for a moment, her heart racing, but then, with a surge of desperation, she lifted the lid. A blinding light erupted from within the box, so bright that it temporarily blinded her. She stumbled back, instinctively raising her hands to shield her eyes. The light swirled around the room, filling every corner, every shadow, until the very air seemed to crackle with energy. When Sarah opened her eyes again, the room was different. The darkness that had consumed the space was gone, replaced by a soft, warm glow. The walls, once crumbling and decayed, were now pristine, the air no longer thick with the oppressive weight of fear. For the first time since she had entered the town, she felt a flicker of hope. But that hope was short-lived. The figure, the entity that had pursued her, was still there. It hadn't gone. It had merely been waiting, watching. And now, as Sarah glanced around, she realized that the light had not chased it away. It had simply revealed something far worse. The figure was no longer alone. The shadows had formed into shapes, distorted, grotesque versions of people Sarah had known, people she had loved. Faces twisted in agony, their bodies contorted in unnatural ways, as though they were trapped in some eternal nightmare. They surrounded her, closing in from all sides, their eyes filled with a hunger that was unmistakable. Sarah, the voice of her mother, once warm, once comforting, whispered through the crowd of twisted figures. "Sarah, you've broken everything. You've brought them back. What are you talking about?" Sarah cried out, her voice strained with panic. "This isn't real. This can't be real." But it didn't matter. The shadows moved closer. And each one of them, each figure, had eyes that gleamed with recognition. She realized, with a sickening jolt in her stomach, that they were her past. Her memories, warped and broken, had taken shape in the darkness. And they were angry. They were angry at her for disturbing the balance, for uncovering the truth. "You can't undo it," one of the figures, the man from the doorway, said, stepping forward from the crowd. His voice was still that same cold, distant tone. "You were never meant to know. None of you were. The price has already been paid." Sarah recoiled, her mind spinning. "The price? What do you mean? What's happening?" The figure's lips curled into something like a smile, though it was more of a sneer. "You should have never found the box. You should have never opened it. Now there's no going back. The curse has been set." The ground beneath her feet trembled again, and the light from the box flickered. The air grew heavy once more, and the figures surrounding her pressed in closer, their expressions twisted with the kind of hatred that made Sarah feel like she was suffocating. "What curse?" Sarah shouted, her voice breaking with desperation. "What are you talking about?" The figure didn't answer. Instead, it stepped back, vanishing into the crowd of distorted faces. They all followed, moving as one, their eyes never leaving her. Sarah tried to back away, but the room was closing in, the walls shifting and bending, their outlines dissolving into the swirling darkness. And then, in the distance, she heard a sound. A faint scraping, like something dragging across the floor. It was slow, deliberate, and it made her blood run cold. The scraping grew louder, nearer, and as she turned toward it, she saw what was making the noise. It was a figure. A shadow. But not like the others. This one was larger, darker. Its presence was suffocating, overwhelming, and as it stepped into the light from the box, Sarah realized with horror that it wasn't just a shadow. It was a creature, something ancient, something evil. The figure had no face. Instead, its head was a mass of writhing, shifting darkness, as though its very form was made of smoke and shadow. It had long, elongated limbs that ended in twisted claws, and its body seemed to bend and contort as it moved toward her. The floor cracked beneath its feet with each step. The creature stopped before her, its twisted form looming over her like a dark omen. She could feel its presence pressing in on her from all sides, suffocating her with a sense of dread that no words could explain. "You shouldn't have come here, Sarah," it said in a voice that was both many and none, as though it spoke from every corner of her mind. Its voice was a slow, drawn-out whisper that echoed through the room, as if it were coming from within her own thoughts. "Why are you doing this?" Sarah gasped, her voice shaking. "What do you want?" It tilted its head, the darkness shifting like a living thing. "What do I want?" it repeated. "I want what's mine. What was taken from me. You've unleashed it, Sarah. The curse was meant to stay buried. And now it's awake." A cold realization washed over her. The figure, this creature, wasn't just a being of shadow. It was the manifestation of the curse itself. The evil that had haunted the town, the evil that had consumed everything it touched. And she had unwittingly set it free. The ground began to shake again, more violently this time. The walls of the room cracked, and the ceiling above them groaned, as if the entire building was on the verge of collapse. The shadows around her pressed in tighter, their forms shifting, coiling around her, feeding on her fear. "You've brought them back," the creature whispered again, its voice softer now, almost purring. "And now they're going to take you." The darkness closed in on her, and the light from the box flickered, fading, dying. Sarah tried to move, tried to run, but her legs wouldn't obey. She felt as if she were frozen in place, the weight of the curse pressing down on her with crushing force. The creature took another step toward her, its claws reaching out, and all Sarah could do was close her eyes and wait for the inevitable. But just as it seemed the shadows would consume her entirely, the light from the box flared one final time. It was blinding, a flash so intense that Sarah had to shield her eyes. And when the light finally faded, she was no longer standing in the room with the creature. She was back in the field. The town was gone. The darkness had vanished. The air was calm, the night peaceful. But the questions remained. Had it all been real? Was the curse still out there? And what had Sarah truly unleashed when she opened that box? The silence pressed in around her as she stood there, alone in the vast expanse of the field, unsure if she had escaped or if she had only just begun to understand the true cost of what she had done. The shadows, she knew, were still waiting. Sarah's fingers trembled as they hovered over the ornate box. The shadows surrounding her seemed to pulse with an almost unbearable intensity, the air thick and heavy with the weight of unseen eyes. Every breath she took felt like it was being suffocated by the darkness closing in on her. But there was no turning back now. This was the moment. She reached out and touched the box. The moment her fingers made contact, the ground beneath her feet seemed to shift. The walls around her groaned as if the building itself was alive, reacting to her touch. A low hum filled the air, vibrating in her chest, the same hum that had echoed through her mind ever since she had first entered this cursed town. Sarah hesitated for a moment, her heart racing, but then, with a surge of desperation, she lifted the lid. A blinding light erupted from within the box, so bright that it temporarily blinded her. She stumbled back, instinctively raising her hands to shield her eyes. The light swirled around the room, filling every corner, every shadow, until the very air seemed to crackle with energy. When Sarah opened her eyes again, the room was different. The darkness that had consumed the space was gone, replaced by a soft, warm glow. The walls, once crumbling and decayed, were now pristine, the air no longer thick with the oppressive weight of fear. For the first time since she had entered the town, she felt a flicker of hope. But that hope was short-lived. The figure, the entity that had pursued her, was still there. It hadn't gone. It had merely been waiting, watching. And now, as Sarah glanced around, she realized that the light had not chased it away. It had simply revealed something far worse. The figure was no longer alone. The shadows had formed into shapes, distorted, grotesque versions of people Sarah had known, people she had loved. Faces twisted in agony, their bodies contorted in unnatural ways, as though they were trapped in some eternal nightmare. They surrounded her, closing in from all sides, their eyes filled with a hunger that was unmistakable. Sarah, the voice of her mother, once warm, once comforting, whispered through the crowd of twisted figures. "Sarah, you've broken everything. You brought them back. What are you talking about?" Sarah cried out, her voice strained with panic. "This isn't real. This can't be real." But it didn't matter. The shadows moved closer. And each one of them, each figure, had eyes that gleamed with recognition. She realized, with a sickening jolt in her stomach, that they were her past. Her memories, warped and broken, had taken shape in the darkness. And they were angry. They were angry at her for disturbing the balance, for uncovering the truth. "You can't undo it," one of the figures, the man from the doorway, said, stepping forward from the crowd. His voice was still that same cold, distant tone. "You were never meant to know. None of you were. The price has already been paid." Sarah recoiled, her mind spinning. "The price? What do you mean? What's happening?" The figure's lips curled into something like a smile, though it was more of a sneer. "You should have never found the box. You should have never opened it. Now there's no going back. The curse has been set." The ground beneath her feet trembled again, and the light from the box flickered. The air grew heavy once more, and the figures surrounding her pressed in closer, their expressions twisted with the kind of hatred that made Sarah feel like she was suffocating. "What curse?" Sarah shouted, her voice breaking with desperation. "What are you talking about?" The figure didn't answer. Instead, it stepped back, vanishing into the crowd of distorted faces. They all followed, moving as one, their eyes never leaving her. Sarah tried to back away, but the room was closing in, the walls shifting and bending, their outlines dissolving into the swirling darkness. And then, in the distance, she heard a sound. A faint scraping like something dragging across the floor. It was slow, deliberate, and it made her blood run cold. The scraping grew louder, nearer, and as she turned toward it, she saw what was making the noise. It was a figure. A shadow. But not like the others. This one was larger, darker. Its presence was suffocating, overwhelming, and as it stepped into the light from the box, Sarah realized with horror that it wasn't just a shadow. It was a creature. Something ancient, something evil. The figure had no face. Instead, its head was a mass of writhing, shifting darkness, as though its very form was made of smoke and shadow. It had long, elongated limbs that ended in twisted claws, and its body seemed to bend and contort as it moved toward her. The floor cracked beneath its feet with each step. The creature stopped before her, its twisted form looming over her like a dark omen. She could feel its presence pressing in on her from all sides, suffocating her with a sense of dread that no words could explain. "You shouldn't have come here, Sarah," it said in a voice that was both many and none, as though it spoke from every corner of her mind. Its voice was a slow, drawn-out whisper that echoed through the room, as if it were coming from within her own thoughts. "Why are you doing this?" Sarah gasped, her voice shaking. "What do you want?" It tilted its head, the darkness shifting like a living thing. "What do I want?" it repeated. "I want what's mine. What was taken from me. You've unleashed it, Sarah. The curse was meant to stay buried. And now it's awake." A cold realization washed over her. The figure, this creature, wasn't just a being of shadow. It was the manifestation of the curse itself. The evil that had haunted the town, the evil that had consumed everything it touched. and she had unwittingly set it free. The ground began to shake again, more violently this time. The walls of the room cracked, and the ceiling above them groaned, as if the entire building was on the verge of collapse. The shadows around her pressed in tighter, their forms shifting, coiling around her, feeding on her fear. "You've brought them back," the creature whispered again, its voice softer now, almost purring. "And now they're going to take you." The darkness closed in on her, and the light from the box flickered, fading, dying. Sarah tried to move, tried to run, but her legs wouldn't obey. She felt as if she were frozen in place, the weight of the curse pressing down on her with crushing force. The creature took another step toward her, its claws reaching out, and all Sarah could do was close her eyes and wait for the inevitable. But just as it seemed the shadows would consume her entirely, the light from the box flared one final time. It was blinding, a flash so intense that Sarah had to shield her eyes. And when the light finally faded, she was no longer standing in the room with the creature. She was back in the field. The town was gone. The darkness had vanished. The air was calm, the night peaceful. But the questions remained. Had it all been real? Was the curse still out there? And what had Sarah truly unleashed when she opened that box? The silence pressed in around her as she stood there, alone in the vast expanse of the field, unsure if she had escaped or if she had only just begun to understand the true cost of what she had done. The shadows, she knew, were still waiting. Story 3. The wind clawed at the edges of the old house as if trying to peel away its secrets. Miles away from civilization, the dilapidated structure stood like a sentinel in the endless fields, its broken windows glaring at the encroaching darkness. Emma tightened her scarf around her neck, feeling the cold seep through despite the thick fabric. Her flashlight flickered, casting uneven beams across the overgrown path. No one sane would come here willingly, but Emma wasn't here out of choice. A letter had arrived 2 weeks ago, written in trembling, uneven script. It simply read, *, your mother's alive. She needs you. Don't tell anyone. *. Her heart had stopped when she read it. Her mother had been declared dead 15 years ago after a freak car accident. Emma had mourned, moved on, or tried to. And now this. The house loomed closer, its shadow swallowing the narrow path. Emma felt an almost primal urge to turn back, to run to her car and speed away. But curiosity, that cruel whisper, kept her feet moving forward. The door creaked open before she even touched it. Her breath hitched. For a moment she considered calling out, but something, a deep, instinctual fear, clamped her throat shut. She stepped inside. The air was heavy, tinged with mildew and something metallic. What? Her flashlight illuminated the peeling wallpaper, the broken furniture, and the scattered remnants of a life long abandoned. A picture frame lay face down on the floor. She bent to pick it up, her hands trembling. It was her mother's wedding photo. The glass was cracked, and someone had scratched out her mother's face. Her heart raced as she scanned the room. She wasn't alone. Emma? The voice was faint, almost a whisper, but it came from upstairs. She froze. Every logical fiber in her body screamed at her to leave. But the voice, so soft, so familiar, kept her rooted. Could it really be her mother? Step by step, she climbed the staircase, each creak of the wood echoing like a gunshot. The upper floor was worse, the air thicker, the darkness deeper. Her flashlight barely pierced the gloom. A shadow darted across the hallway. "Mom," she called, her voice barely audible. Silence. She reached the end of the hall, where a single door stood ajar. Her hand shook as she pushed it open. The room was empty, save for a single rocking chair in the corner. It swayed gently, though there was no breeze. A faint humming filled the room, a melody she hadn't heard since childhood. It was her mother's lullaby. "Emma, why did you come here?" The voice was clearer now, and it was unmistakably her mother's. But it wasn't coming from the room. It was behind her. She spun around, her flashlight illuminating nothing but the empty hallway. Then the door slammed shut, plunging her into darkness. Emma's breath came in ragged gasps as she pounded on the door, but it wouldn't budge. The darkness around her felt alive, pressing in from all sides. The lullaby echoed faintly, seeping through the cracks in her sanity. "Mom," she screamed, her voice trembling. "If this is you, answer me." A laugh, a low, guttural sound, reverberated in response. It wasn't her mother. The flashlight flickered, threatening to die, and Emma smacked it against her palm. The beam stabilized but revealed something far worse. Scratches covered the walls, deep grooves that formed crude, chaotic patterns. Some looked like desperate claw marks. Others were more deliberate, almost resembling symbols. One word was carved repeatedly across the plaster. Asterisk lies. Asterisk. The lullaby stopped. Suddenly, a sound came from behind her, a faint shuffle like bare feet on wood. She whipped around, flashlight trembling in her grip. Nothing. The air grew colder and her breath puffed in small clouds. She felt the floor beneath her feet creak and groan as if it couldn't support her weight any longer. Panic surged through her veins. She had to get out. Her fingers fumbled along the walls, searching for anything, a hidden latch, a weak spot, a way out. Instead, her hand grazed something soft and warm. She yanked her hand back, heart hammering. Turning the flashlight toward it, she saw a smudged handprint on the wall, fresh and glistening red. What? Emma? The whisper came again, closer this time, practically brushing her ear. She spun around and came face to face with a figure she hadn't seen in 15 years. Her mother. Or at least, something wearing her mother's face. The features were familiar, the sharp cheekbones, the soft brown eyes, but they were wrong. Too perfect, too still, like a wax figure come to life. The skin stretched unnaturally tight, the eyes wide and unblinking. Her mother's mouth moved, but the voice that came out was distorted, layered with something ancient and cold. You shouldn't have come here. Emma stumbled back, her flashlight beam shaking wildly. You're dead. The thing tilted its head, a grotesque smile stretching across its face. Dead? No. But you might be, if you stay. The flashlight dimmed again, and Emma screamed as the figure lunged toward her. She swung the flashlight instinctively, but it passed through empty air. The room was silent again, but something had changed. The walls, once cracked and peeling, were now covered in photographs, hundreds of them. All of Emma. In each photo she was doing something ordinary, walking to work, sitting at a cafe, sleeping in her bed. But in every single image, there was a shadowy figure in the background, watching her. Her legs felt like jelly, but she forced herself to move, tearing her eyes away from the photos. She reached for the door again, praying it would open this time. It did, but what lay beyond was no longer the hallway. It was a staircase, spiraling downward into pitch blackness. A chill ran down her spine, but she had no choice. Staying in this room wasn't an option. She descended, each step echoing into the void below. The farther she went, the less the stairs felt like stairs. The wood gave way to stone, rough and uneven. The air grew damp, and a foul stench filled her nostrils, like rot and decay. At the bottom, her flashlight revealed a cavernous space. The walls glistened with moisture, and strange symbols were etched into the stone. In the center of the room stood a large, ornate mirror, its surface dark and rippling like water. Drawn to it despite her fear, Emma approached. Her reflection stared back at her, but there was something wrong. Her reflection's eyes didn't move when hers did. They stared straight ahead, unblinking. "Help me," her reflection whispered, pressing its palms against the glass. Emma stumbled back, her heart thundering. She turned to run, but the path she'd come from was gone. The cavern stretched endlessly in all directions, the mirror the only thing remaining. Her reflection smiled, a twisted, malevolent grin. "You can't leave," it said. "You're already part of this." The mirror pulsed, its surface rippling like liquid, distorting Emma's twisted reflection. She stumbled backward, her mind spinning with disbelief. Her breathing was shallow, each gasp catching in her throat as the cavern seemed to close in around her. "You can't leave," the reflection repeated, its voice now echoing from all directions. Emma clenched her fists, trying to muster the courage to speak. "What do you mean? What is this place? What do you want from me?" The reflection tilted its head, mimicking her movement in a grotesque parody. "You came here. You brought yourself. And now you belong." "Belong to what?" she shouted, her voice cracking. The reflection's grin widened unnaturally, and the mirror began to drip, thick, black liquid oozing from its edges and pooling onto the stone floor. The liquid crept toward her like it had a will of its own, glistening in the dim light of her fading flashlight. Emma's instincts screamed at her to run, but there was nowhere to go. She backed against the wall, her hands pressing into the cold, damp stone as the liquid inched closer. The mirror pulsed again, and a shadow emerged from its surface. It wasn't human. Its form was tall and spindly, limbs too long and bent at unnatural angles. Its face, or what should have been its face, was smooth, featureless, and black as midnight. Yet somehow, Emma could feel its gaze piercing her, like icy fingers clawing at her soul. "You've seen too much," the thing hissed, its voice a raspy whisper that vibrated through the air. "They will come now." Emma's mind raced. Asterisk they? Who is they? What does it mean? Asterisk, but before she could ask, the ground beneath her feet trembled. The symbols on the walls began to glow, pulsing with a sickly green light. The air grew heavy, thick with an oppressive energy that pressed down on her chest. A high-pitched scream tore through the cavern, and Emma clamped her hands over her ears. It wasn't a human scream, it was layered like 1,000 voices crying out in agony at once. Then they appeared. Figures began to materialize from the walls, their bodies translucent and shifting, like smoke trapped in human form. They hovered above the ground, their faces twisted into masks of pain and rage. Emma's legs gave out and she collapsed onto the cold stone floor. The figures surrounded her, their hollow eyes locked onto her trembling form. "You shouldn't be here," one of them said, its voice like the scrape of metal on stone. "I didn't mean to," Emma sobbed, tears streaming down her face. "I don't even know what this place is." "You came," another figure said, its voice softer but no less terrifying. "You opened the door. Now you must choose." "Choose what?" Emma cried, her voice trembling. The figures parted, revealing the mirror once more. But now, the liquid covering its surface had cleared, and Emma could see a scene unfolding within it. It was her house, her cozy little home miles away from this nightmare. She saw herself sitting at the kitchen table, sipping coffee and scrolling through her phone. Everything looked normal, peaceful. Then the scene shifted. The Emma in the mirror looked up, her expression twisting in horror as the shadowy figure from the photographs loomed behind her. Its long, spindly fingers reached out, and the lights in the house flickered. "Stop!" Emma screamed, reaching out as if she could touch the mirror. But her hand passed through empty air. The figures around her began to chant, their voices blending into a low, guttural hum. The mirror's surface rippled again, and the scene changed once more. This time she saw a small child, a boy she didn't recognize, sitting in a dark room. He was crying, his tiny shoulders shaking as he hugged his knees to his chest. The shadow was there too, circling him like a predator. "You can save him," one of the figures said, its voice echoing in her mind. "How?" Emma whispered, her voice barely audible. "Step through," the figure replied, motioning toward the mirror. Emma's stomach churned. The liquid on the mirror's edges still oozed onto the floor, and the thought of touching it made her skin crawl. But the boy's sobs grew louder, and her heart ached at the sound. "Why me?" she asked, her voice breaking. "You came," the figures said in unison, their tone final. "You opened the door. Only you can close it?" Emma's hands shook as she stepped closer to the mirror. The surface shimmered, and she could feel its cold energy radiating toward her. The boy's cries grew louder, more desperate. Taking a deep breath, she reached out. The moment her fingers touched the surface, a blinding light enveloped her, and the cavern disappeared. She was falling, tumbling through an endless void. Whispers filled her ears, voices she couldn't understand but felt deep in her bones. When she finally landed, the air was knocked from her lungs and she gasped for breath. She was in the room with the boy. The shadow turned toward her, its eyeless face somehow locking onto hers. It let out a guttural snarl and lunged. The shadow's lunge was like a hurricane of darkness, faster, colder, and more overwhelming than anything Emma had ever felt. Her instincts screamed at her to move, but fear rooted her to the ground. The boy screamed, his cries piercing through the suffocating gloom. Just before the shadow's claws reached her, Emma dove to the side, narrowly avoiding its grasp. She hit the floor hard, pain jolting through her body, but there was no time to recover. The shadow whirled around, its elongated limbs stretching unnaturally as it prepared to strike again. "Stay behind me," she yelled to the boy, her voice shaking but firm. The boy scrambled back, pressing himself against the wall, his wide eyes fixed on the shadow. Emma's mind raced. She had no weapons, no plan, and no idea what this thing was or how to fight it. But she couldn't let it hurt the boy. The room seemed alive, pulsing with the shadow's malevolent energy. The walls shimmered with the same strange symbols she had seen in the cavern, their glow intensifying as the shadow moved. Emma noticed something, a pattern in the symbols that seemed to shift and pulse as the shadow passed near them. The symbols react to it, Maybe they can hurt it, she thought, desperation giving birth to the faintest flicker of hope. The shadow lunged again, and this time Emma was ready. She grabbed a chair from the corner and swung it with all her might. The wood shattered against the shadow's form, splinters flying everywhere. The creature didn't flinch. Instead, it let out a soundless laugh, its featureless face tilting as if mocking her efforts. Then it turned its attention to the boy. "No?" Emma screamed, throwing herself in front of the child just as the shadow's claws slashed through the air. Pain erupted in her arm as its icy touch grazed her skin, leaving a jagged, blackened mark. She bit back a scream, her body trembling from the searing cold that radiated from the wound. The symbols on the walls pulsed brighter, almost as if reacting to her pain. Emma's gaze darted to them, realization dawning. The symbols weren't just passive markings. They were alive, and they seemed tied to the shadow's presence. She reached out, her fingers brushing against one of the glowing symbols. A shockwave rippled through the room. The shadow recoiled, its form flickering like a glitching image. "It works," she muttered, her voice barely audible over the pounding in her chest. Summoning every ounce of courage, Emma grabbed the boy's hand and pulled him to his feet. "Stay close to me," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. The shadow howled, its elongated arms slamming into the walls, shaking the room violently. Emma dragged the boy toward another glowing symbol, her injured arm burning with every movement. She pressed her palm against the symbol, and another shockwave erupted. The shadow let out a piercing shriek, its form shrinking slightly. "It's weakening," she shouted, adrenaline surging through her veins. But the shadow wasn't done. It gathered itself, its form coiling like a spring, and launched forward with terrifying speed. Emma barely had time to react, pulling the boy down as the shadow's claws swiped inches above their heads. "Keep moving," she urged, her voice frantic. She led the boy around the room, touching every glowing symbol she could reach. Each time, the shadow recoiled, its form growing smaller and weaker. But it was adapting. The symbols began to dim as the shadow moved faster, dodging Emma's attempts to reach them. She was running out of options, and the boy's terrified sobs were like daggers to her heart. "Why won't it stop?" the boy cried, his small hands clutching her arm. Emma didn't have an answer. Her mind raced, searching for a solution. Then she remembered the mirror. It had brought her here. Maybe it could take them out. She scanned the room, her eyes landing on the mirror's faint outline in the far corner. Its surface shimmered faintly, as if struggling to maintain its connection to this place. "Over there," she said, pulling the boy toward it. The shadow roared, sensing their intent. It slammed into the ground in front of them, blocking their path. Emma's grip tightened on the boy's hand as she took a step back. "You want me, don't you?" she said, her voice trembling. "Leave him alone. It's me you want." The shadow paused, its head tilting as if considering her words. Then, slowly, it withdrew, its form towering over her like a storm cloud. "Emma," it hissed, her name dripping with malice. Taking advantage of the moment, Emma shoved the boy toward the mirror. "Go. Touch the glass." The boy hesitated, his tear-streaked face filled with fear. "What about you?" "Just do it," she screamed. The shadow lunged, but Emma stepped forward, putting herself between it and the boy. She braced for the impact, but the shadow stopped inches away, its form flickering violently. The boy reached the mirror, his small hands pressing against its surface. A blinding light erupted, consuming the room. The shadow let out an ear-splitting wail, its form disintegrating into wisps of smoke that were sucked into the mirror. Emma felt herself being pulled as well, the light enveloping her until there was nothing but silence. When she opened her eyes, she was back in the old house, lying on the dusty floor. The boy was beside her, unconscious but breathing. The mirror was gone. The silence in the house was deafening. Emma sat up slowly, her body aching from the terror she had just endured. She blinked several times, trying to adjust to the dim light filtering through the cracked windows. The boy, his name still a blur in her mind, lay next to her, unconscious but alive. Her pulse was still racing, and her breath came in uneven gasps. The events from moments ago, the dark, shapeless thing, the mirror, the boy, felt like a nightmare too unreal to be true. She had seen that creature, that shadow, so clearly, felt its icy touch. But now, everything seemed strangely still. Was it over? Emma glanced around the room. The walls, once pulsating with ominous energy, were now just cracked plaster. Her photos, had vanished. The air no longer felt suffocating, though the weight of what had happened still hung heavily in her chest. She stood up carefully, wincing from the pain in her arm. Her skin was marked with a blackened burn where the shadow's claws had scraped her, but it didn't hurt as much now. The wound had cooled like it was never there to begin with. The boy stirred, a soft groan escaping his lips. He blinked, disoriented, and looked around. His wide, terrified eyes locked onto Emma. Are we safe now?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. Emma didn't know how to answer. She opened her mouth, but the words wouldn't come. She wasn't sure if they were safe, or if this was just another illusion. I think so," she finally managed to say, though she didn't believe it herself. The boy nodded slowly, sitting up with a wince. He looked younger than he had before, smaller, almost fragile, but there was a determination in his eyes, a strength that surprised Emma. "What's your name?" she asked softly, unsure why she hadn't asked sooner. The boy hesitated. Elliot. She repeated the name in her mind, trying to attach it to a face that didn't seem to belong here. "Elliot, do you remember what happened?" He shook his head. I don't know. I was just in my room, and then it felt like something was watching me. Then I heard the whispers." He looked down, his small hands clenched in his lap. "I tried to leave, but it wouldn't let me." Emma felt a knot tighten in her stomach. "The shadow was after you. But why? Why me? Why you?" Elliot swallowed hard, his eyes distant as he stared at the floor. "I don't know. But it felt like it was always going to be here. It's not over. It can't be." The weight of his words settled over her like a thick fog. The house, though normal in appearance, still felt wrong. The shadows in the corners seemed to stretch further, and the air tasted stale, like something had been rotting beneath the surface. "We need to get out of here," Emma said, her voice firm. Elliot nodded quickly, his eyes wide with fear. "Yes, please. I don't want to stay here anymore." As Emma stood to her feet, the house seemed to groan in protest, its walls shifting ever so slightly, as if the building itself was alive. The floorboards creaked beneath her, and for a moment she swore she heard faint whispers, soft, sibilant voices that seemed to come from every direction. But when she turned, there was nothing. She grabbed Elliot's hand and pulled him toward the door, her heart racing again. They didn't need to know why the house felt wrong, just that it did. They needed to leave before whatever it was came back for them. The door swung open with an unnatural ease, and Emma stepped into the hallway, her senses alert. The air outside the room was thick and oppressive, much like the house had been when they first entered. The faint smell of decay lingered in the air, mixing with a sour taste in her mouth. They crept down the hallway, the flickering light of the hallway lamp casting strange, stretching shadows on the walls. Emma could feel it now, the weight of something behind them, following them. She dared not turn around, afraid that the moment she did, it would be too late. "Keep moving," she whispered, her voice barely audible, as if speaking louder might draw the shadows closer. Elliot's grip tightened on her hand as they moved faster, almost running toward the stairs. But when they reached the staircase, something in the air shifted. The ground trembled beneath their feet, a low rumble that vibrated in their bones. Emma looked up at the ceiling. There, hanging from the rafters, were strange symbols. They were etched in dark ink, almost like burnt sigils, and as her eyes traced them, she felt a cold shiver crawl up her spine. They weren't part of the house's structure. They were placed there deliberately. "It's watching us," she thought. Suddenly, the staircase before them seemed to stretch impossibly long. The stairs blurred, warping and twisting as if mocking them. "No?" Emma whispered, fear rising in her chest. "We were already here. The same hallway, the same staircase. It was all repeating." Elliot tugged on her arm, his face pale. "What's happening?" Before Emma could answer, the door at the end of the hall slammed open. From the darkness beyond, a figure stepped into view. It wasn't the shadow from before, but it was just as terrifying. Its form was tall and gaunt, its features distorted and wrong. Its eyes, though empty and hollow, locked onto Emma with a malicious intent. "This isn't your place anymore," it said, its voice like 1,000 voices hissing together. Emma froze, her blood running cold. The thing stepped forward, its limbs long and twisting unnaturally as it moved toward them. There was nowhere to run. The figure loomed in the doorway, its shape flickering like a distorted reflection in broken glass. Its presence was suffocating, the air thick with an unseen weight, pressing down on Emma's chest as if trying to crush her very breath. Elliot clung to her side, his face pale with terror, but Emma didn't have time to comfort him. All she could focus on was the creature before them. Its hollow eyes, its twisted form, the way it moved as if the laws of nature no longer applied to it. It spoke again, its voice like 1,000 whispers scraped across broken glass. This house, this world, it is mine. Emma's pulse pounded in her ears, the fear rising like a tidal wave ready to drown her. She could feel the temperature drop, the air growing colder with every word the figure uttered. Her thoughts were a blur. There was no time to think, only to survive. Why are you doing this? Emma found herself asking, her voice shaky but loud enough for the thing to hear. She didn't know if it could answer, but she needed to understand why she and Elliot were trapped here. What was this place? And why did this creature want them so badly? The figure tilted its head, its long, unnatural neck snapping with a sickening crack. You are a mistake, it hissed. An intrusion. And like all mistakes, you will be erased. Before Emma could react, the creature lunged forward, its long fingers reaching toward her. Time seemed to slow as she watched the claws extend, cold and sharp as they sliced through the air. She barely had time to pull Elliot back, dragging him toward the wall as the shadowy figure's claws scraped the floor, sending a shower of sparks into the air. A scream built in her throat, but Emma didn't let it out. She couldn't. If she gave in to the fear, it would be over. Instead, she pushed herself off the wall, shoving Elliot toward the staircase. Go, she screamed, her heart hammering in her chest. Elliot hesitated for a second, his eyes locked on the creature with fear, but when Emma's hand pushed him forward, he ran, his tiny feet thundering down the stairs. Emma followed him, but she didn't dare look back. Not yet. The house seemed to stretch with every step they took, the stairs curving endlessly like a maze that had no end. The flickering lights above them cast shadows that seemed to shift and grow as they descended, as if the walls themselves were alive and watching them. She could hear the creature following them, its movements far too fast, its footsteps louder with each passing moment. But when Emma glanced over her shoulder, the creature had vanished. She felt a momentary flicker of hope, but it was quickly squashed by the rising panic in her chest. The house wasn't letting them leave. They weren't free. Elliot was ahead of her now, his legs moving faster, his breath coming in sharp gasps. He had no idea where he was going, but neither did she. She wanted to tell him to slow down, to take a breath, but her own fear kept her feet moving faster. They had to get out. There had to be a way. Suddenly, the stairs twisted again, the once straight path spiraling into an endless descent. Emma stumbled, feeling herself fall into the void. The ground beneath her gave way and she fell, her body hitting the hard floor with a sickening thud. A sharp pain shot through her side as she groaned, but there was no time to rest. She pushed herself to her feet, but she couldn't find Elliot. She called his name, her voice cracking with panic. Elliot? A small whimper echoed from the shadows. Emma turned toward it, her heart stopping in her chest. There, crouching in the corner, was Elliot, his face pale and streaked with tears. His eyes were wide with terror as he stared at something behind her. She turned around slowly, her stomach dropping as she realized what was happening. The shadow had returned. But this time it wasn't just one form, it was a multitude, shadows piled on top of each other, a writhing mass of darkness, each one screaming, howling, reaching toward them. The figures, once distant and almost intangible, now had faces, terrible, twisted faces with empty eyes that seemed to stare directly into her soul. Their mouths stretched impossibly wide as they chanted in unison, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to vibrate the very air. Asterisk, get out of here, asterisk. The words weren't spoken, they were felt, resonating deep in her chest, pulling at her very being. Emma's skin crawled as if the words were leaving behind an imprint, a burn that wouldn't fade. The shadows seemed to ripple, converging toward them, their shapes ever-changing, impossible to track. No, Emma screamed, stepping in front of Elliot. Leave us alone. The mass of shadows paused for a moment, as if considering her defiance. Then, one of the shadows broke away from the mass, moving forward, its form solidifying into a shape, tall and human but distorted, just like the first creature. It reached out with elongated hands, its claws sharp and gleaming. Emma didn't know what else to do. She grabbed Elliot's hand, pulling him to his feet. We have to go. We have to get out of this place now. They ran again, but the house twisted as they moved. Every door they reached was just another wall. Every hallway looped back on itself, the rooms shifting like living things closing in on them. The lights flickered and dimmed, casting the house in darkness. The creature was closer now, the sounds of its movements growing louder, more frantic. The shadows were everywhere, closing in on them. Emma's breath was ragged, her legs burning with the effort, but still the door they needed, the exit, was just out of reach. And then a voice, soft, almost like a whisper, like a lullaby sung from a distance. Asterisk, this is your last chance, asterisk. The words chilled Emma to the bone. She froze, her blood turning to ice as the shadows stopped moving. For a moment all was still. The air itself seemed to hold its breath. The voice continued, clearer now, its tone dark and commanding. Asterisk, step into the dark. Or remain here. Forever, asterisk. Elliot looked up at her, confusion and fear written across his face. Emma couldn't make sense of what was happening, but she knew one thing. This wasn't just a choice between the house and the creature. This was something deeper, something worse. The air was thick with tension, and Emma's chest tightened as the shadows around them seemed to pulse with an unnatural rhythm. Every breath felt like a struggle, each heartbeat echoing through her skull. The voice, low, guttural, and insistent, hung in the air like a heavy cloud. Step into the dark, or remain here forever. The words lingered, chilling her to the core. Elliot's grip on her hand tightened, his small body trembling beside her. His wide, terrified eyes searched her face, looking for some sort of reassurance. But Emma had none to give. She was just as trapped, just as scared. I don't want to stay here, he whispered, his voice barely audible. Emma nodded, the weight of the moment bearing down on her. She couldn't let him stay here. She couldn't let herself stay here. But there was no easy way out. The shadows pressed in on them from all sides, closing off any path that led to freedom. In that moment, Emma knew there was only one choice. They had to face whatever was in that darkness. Let's go, she said, her voice shaky but resolute. She squeezed Elliot's hand one last time, the decision made. She stepped forward into the thick, suffocating dark, praying that somehow this would end. As she moved deeper into the shadows, the air seemed to shift. The whispers grew louder, swirling around her, trying to pull her in, drown her with fear. She could hear Elliot's soft, panicked breaths beside her. But she kept moving forward toward the unknown. The darkness felt endless, like a living thing, surrounding her, suffocating her, yet drawing her in with every step. Then, suddenly, everything stopped. The shadows fell away and she found herself standing in a place, familiar, yet completely different. The house was gone. The walls, the floors, the oppressive air, all vanished. In its place was a desolate landscape, a barren wasteland under an empty sky. The only sound was the wind, whispering through the emptiness. Emma turned around. Elliot was beside her, still holding her hand, but the look in his eyes had changed. He wasn't just afraid anymore. There was something else in his gaze, a strange, hollow recognition. Where are we? Emma whispered, more to herself than to him. Elliot didn't answer. He just stared ahead, his eyes fixed on something in the distance. Emma followed his gaze and froze. In the far distance, on the horizon, she saw a figure standing alone, its form tall and gaunt, shadowed by the dying light of the world around them. The figure wasn't moving, was watching them. Then she understood. This place wasn't just an empty wasteland. It was the edge of the world, the place where those lost to the darkness go. Where the things that follow you in the shadows linger, waiting for you to break. And in that moment, Emma realized that there was no escape. The creature, the darkness, the endless twisting house, they were not merely things to be outrun. They were a part of her now. They followed her. They always would. With a shudder, Emma turned to Elliot, her heart heavy with the knowledge she now carried. He had seen it too. The terror was in his eyes. And just like her, there was no turning back. They would remain here in this place for as long as the shadows wanted them. The wind howled around them, but no words were spoken. The journey had ended. But the darkness? It would never let go.